Chapter 8 Georgie's Room and the House on Neobolt Street. 1. Richie Torzar turned off the radio, which has been blaring out Madonna's Like a Virgin on WZON, a station which declares itself to be Bangor's AM stereo rocker with a kind of historical frequency, pulls over to the side of the road, shuts down the engine of the Mustang the Avis peoples rented him at Bangor International, and gets out. He hears the pull and release of his arm, breath in his ears. He has seen a sign which has caused the flesh of his back to break out in the hard ridges of goose flesh. He walks to the front of the car and puts one hand on its hood. He hears the engine ticking softly to itself as it cools. He hears a jay scream frightfully and then shut up. There are crickets, and as far as the soundtrack goes, that's it. He has been seen the sign and passes it. And suddenly, he is in Derry again. After 25 years, Richie Trashmouth Torzar has come home. He has burning agony suddenly needles into his eye, breaking his thought cleanly off. He utters a strangled little shout of his hands fly up to his face. The only time he felt anything even remotely like this burning pain was when he got an eyelash caught another one of his contract in college, and that was only in one eye. This terribly pain is in both. But before he can reach even halfway to his face, the pain is gone. He lowers his hand again, slowly, thoughtfully, and looks down. Route 7. He left the turnpike at the Enter Heaven exit. Wanted for some reason he doesn't understand not to come in by turnpike, which was still Wake contracting in the Derry arena when he and his folks shut the dust of this weird little town from their heels and headed out to the Midwest. No, the turnpike would have been quicker, but it would have been wrong, so he had driving along Route 9 through the sleeping nestle of buildings that was Heaven Village, then turned off on Route 7. And as he went, the day grew steadily brighter. Now this sign, it was the same sort of sign which marked the borders of more than 600 Maine towns. But how this one had squeezed his heart. Penobscot County, Derry, Maine. Beyond that, an elk sign, a Roucher Club sign, and completely the trilogy, a sign proclaiming the fact that Derry Lions roar for the United Fund. Past that one, there is in the Route 7 again, continuing on in a straight line between Holken banks of pine and spruce. In this silent light, as the day steadies itself, those trees look as dreamy as blue-gray cigarette smoke stacked on the not moveless air of the sealed room. Derry, he thinks, Derry, God help me, Derry, stone the crowns. Here he is on Route 7, 5 miles up. If time or tornado has not carried it anyway in an intervening year, will be the Rublin farms where his mother brought all of their eggs and most of their vegetables. 2 miles beyond that road, Route 7 became Witcham Road, and of course, Witcham Road eventually became Witcham Street. Can you give me Hallelujah World without end amen? And somewhere along there between the Rublin farms in town, he would drive past the Bowers place and the Hanlon place. A mile or so after Hanlon's, he would see the first glitter of the Kensducks and the first spread and tangle of poison green, the lush lowlands that had been known for some reason as the Barrens. I really don't know if I can face all of that, Richie thinks. I mean, let's tell the truth here, folks. I just don't know if I can. The whole previous night has passed, in a dream for him. As long he continued traveling, moving forward, making miles, the dream went on, but now he has stopped, or rather the sun has stopped him, and he has awakened to the strange truth. The dream was the reality. Deary is the reality. It seems he just cannot stop remembering. He thinks the memories will eventually drive him mad, and now he bites down on his lips. He puts his hand together, palm to palm, tight, as if to keep himself from flying apart. He feels that he will fly apart, and soon there seems to be some mad part of him which actually looks forward to what may be coming. But most of him only wonders how he's going to get through the next few days. And now his thoughts break off again. A deer is walking out into the road. He can hear the light thud of its spring-soft boofs on the tar. Richie's breath stops in the mid-exhale, then slowly starts again. He looks dumbfounded, part of him, thinking that he never saw anything like this in Radio Drive. No, he needed to come back home to see something like this. It's a doe, a deer, a female deer. A voice chants merrily in his head. She's come out of the woods on the right and pauses in the middle of Route 7. Front legs on the one side of the broken white line, rear legs on the other. Her drink eyes regard Rich Torzor mightily. He reads interest in those eyes, but no fear. He looks at her in wonder, thinking she's an O'May or a Porton or some sort of Madame Ascono shit like that. And then, quite unexpectedly, a memory of Mr. Nell comes to him. What a start he had given them that day, busting in on them in the wake of Bill's story and Ben's story and Eddie's story. The whole bunch of them had damn near gone up to heaven. Now, looking at the deer, Rich draws in the deep breath and finds himself speaking in the one of his voices, but for the first time in 25 years or more, it is the voice of the Irish cop, one he had incorporated into his representation after that memorable day. It comes rolling out of the morning silence like a great big bowling ball. It is louder and bigger than Richie would ever have believed. Jesus Christ, on a jumped up carrier driving Kutch. What's a nice girl like you doing out on one of the wilderness, dear? Jesus Christ, you be getting on home before I decided to tell Father O'Sagarin on ye. Before the echoes had died, before the first shock, Jay can begun scolding him for his scouring. The doe flicks her tail at him like a truce flag and disappears into the smoky-looking firs on the left side of the road, leaving only a small pile of streaming pellets behind to show that even at 37, Richie Torzor, it's still capable of getting off a good one from time to time. Richie begins to laugh. He is only clucking at first, and then his own Linergan strikes him, standing here in the dawn light of a Maine morning, 3,400 miles from home, shouting at a deer in the accents of an Irish cop. The chuckles became a string of giggles. The giggles become goughs. The goughs become howls. And he is finally reduced to holding on to his car while tears roll down his face. And he wonders dimly if he's going to wet his pants or what. Every time he starts to get control of himself, his eyes fix on that little clump of pellets, and he goes off into fresh gales, snorting and snickering. He is at last able to get back into the driver's seat and restart the Mustang's engine. An Orcarin and Elemental fertilizer truck snores by in a blast of wind. After it passes him, Rich pulls out and heads for Derry again. He feels better now, in control, or maybe it's just that he's moving again, making miles, and the dream has rearrested itself. He starts thinking about Mr. Nell again. Mr. Nell in that day by the dam. Mr. Nell had asked them who fought this little trick up. He can see the five of them looking uneasily at each other and remembers how Ben finally stepped forward, cheeks pale and eyes downcast, face trembling all over as he fought grimly to keep from blabbering. Poor kid probably thought he was going to 5 to 10 and Shawshank for back flooding the drains of Witcham Street. Rich thinks now, but he had owned up to it just the same, and by doing that, he had forced the rest of them to come forward and back him up. It was either that or considering themselves bad guys, cowards, all the things their TV's heroes were not. And that had welded them together, for better or worse, had apparently welded them together for the last 27 years. Sometimes events are dominoes. The first knocks over the second knocks over the third, and there you are. When Richie wonders, did it become too late to turn back when he and Stan showed up and pitched him helping to build the dam? When Bill, and then how the school picture of his brother had turned its head and winked? Maybe, but to Richie Torzor, it seemed the dominoes really begun to fall when Ben Hinscombe stepped forward and said, I showed them, too. How to do it. It's my fault. Mr. Nell simply stood there, looking at him, lips pressed together, hands on his creaking black leather belt. He looked from Ben to the spreading pole behind the dam, and then back to Ben again, his face of that of a man who can't believe what he is seeing. He was a barely Irishman, his hair a permanent white, combed back in neat waves beneath his peaked blue cap. His eyes were bright blue, his nose bright red. There were small nests of burst capillaries in his cheeks. He was a man of nowhere than medium height, but to the five boys arrayed before him, he looked at least at 8 feet tall. Mr. Nell opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Bill Debrog had stepped up beside Ben. It was my idea, he finally managed to say. He heaved in a gigantic gulping breath, and as Mr. Nell stood there, regarding him impressively, the sun tossing back and permanently flashing from his badge, Bill managed to stutter out the rest of what he needed to say. It wasn't Ben's fault. Ben just happened to come along and show them how to do better what they were already doing badly. Me too, Eddie said absurdly, and stepped up on Ben's other side. What's this, me too? Mr. Nell asked. Is that your name or your address, buckaroo? Eddie flashed brightly. The color went all the way up to the moon of his hair. I was with Bill before Ben even came, he said. That was all I meant. Richie stepped up next to Eddie. The idea that a voice or two might cheer Mr. Nell up a little, get him thinking jolly thoughts, popped into his head. On second thoughts were for Richie extremely rare and wonderful things. Maybe a voice or two might only make things worse. Mr. Nell didn't look like he was in what Richie sometimes thought of as a chuckle in his mood. In fact, Mr. Nell looked like maybe Chucks were the last thing on his mind. So he just said, I was in on it too, in a low voice, and then made his mouth shut up. And me, Stan said, stepping up next to Bill. And now the five of them were standing before Mr. Nell in a line. Ben looked from one side to the other. More than dazed, he was almost stupefied by their support. For a moment, Richie thought only Haystack was going to burst into tears of gratitude. Generous Mr. Nell said again, and although he sounded deeply disgusted, his face suddenly looked as if it might like to laugh. A sorrier bunch of boyos I ain't never seen. If your folks knew where you were, I guess there'll be some hot bottoms tonight. I ain't sure there won't be anyway. Richie could hold back no longer. His mouth simply fell open and then ran away like the gingerbread man, as if so often did. How's things back in the old country? Mr. Nell, it buggled. Ah, you're a sight for sore eyes. Sure, and Begrat, you're a lovely man, a credit to the old sod. I'll be a credit to the seat of your pants in about 3 seconds, my dear little friend, Mr. Nell said dryly. Bill turned on him, snarled, "For God's sake, Richie, shut up!" "Good advice, Master William Deprog," Mr. Nell said. "I'll bet Zach doesn't know you're down here in the barns playing among us the floating turnips, does he?" Bill dropped his eyes, shook his head, wild rose burned in his cheeks. Mr. Nell looked at Ben. "I don't recall your name, son." "Ben Hanscom, sir." Ben whispered. Mr. Nell nodded and looked back at the dam again. "This was your idea?" "How to build it? Yeah," Ben's whispered was now nearly inaudible. "Well, you're a hell of an engineer, big boy, but don't you know jack shit about these here barns or the dairy drainage system? Do you?" Ben shook his head. "Not unkindly," Mr. Nell told him. "There's 2 parts to the system. One part carries solid humans waste shit. If I'd not to be oftenary yet tender ears, the other parts carries gray water flushed from toilets or run down the drains from sinks and washing machines and showers. It's almost the water that runs down the gutters into the city drains. Well, we've caused no problems with the solid waste removal. Thank God that get pumps into the Kenspick a bit farther down. There's probably some almighty big patties down that way half a mile, drying in the sun, thanks to what you done. But you can be pretty sure that there ain't shit sticking to anyone's ceiling because of it. But for the gray water, well, there's no pumps for gray water. That's all runs downhill in what the engineer boyos call gravity drains. And I'll bet you know where all them gravity drains end up, don't you, big boy?" "Up there," Ben said. He pointed to the area behind the dam, the area they had in large part submerged. He did this without looking up. Big tears were beginning, of course, to course slowly down his cheeks. Mr. Nell pretended not to notice. "That's right, my large young friend. All them gravity drains feel into streams that feed into the upper barrens. In fact, a good many of them little streams that come trickling down are gray water, and gray water only, coming out of drains you can't even see. They're so deep buried in the underbrush. The shit goes one way and everything else goes the other. God praise the clever mindo man. And did it ever cross your mind that you'd spent the whole livelong day paddling around in Derry's pee and old washwater?" Eddie suddenly began to gasp and had to been used aspirin. "What you did was back water up into about 608 central catch basins that serve Witcham and Jackson and Kansan and 4 or 5 little streets that run between them." Mr. Nell fixed Bill. 4 or 5 little streets that run between them. Mr. Nell fixed Bill. Deprog with a dry glance. "One of them serves your own hearth in a home, young Master Deprog. So there we are, with sinks that won't drain, washing machines that won't drain, outflow pipes pouring merrily into cellars." Ben let out a dry barking sob. The others turned toward him and then looked away. Mr. Nell put a large hand on the boy's shoulder. It was caustic and hard, but at the moment it was also gentle. Now, no need to take on, big boy. Maybe it ain't that bad. At least not yet. Could be exterminated just a mite to make sure you took my point. They sent me down to see if a tree blew down across the stream. That happens from time to time. There's no need for anyone but me and you, 5 to know it. Wasn't just that. We've got more important things to worry about in town these days than a little backup water. I'll say on my report that I located that blowdown, and some boys came along and helped me shift it out the water. Not that I'll mention my name by name. You'll not be getting any consideration for damn building in the barns. He serviced the 5 of them. Ben was fiercely wiping his eyes with his handkerchiefs, Bill was looking thoughtfully at the dam. Eddie was holding his aspirin in one hand. Stan stood close by Richie, with one hand on Richie's arm, ready to squeeze hard if Richie should show the slightest sign of having anything to say other than thank you very much. You boys got no business at all in a dirty place like this. Mr. Neal went on. There's probably 60 different kinds of Odysseus breeding down there. Breeding came out Brennan, as in what a girl may do with her hair. In the morning, dumped down one day, streams full of piss and gray water, muck and slop, bugs and bracklins, quick mud. You got no business at all in a dirty place like this. 4 clean cities parked for you boyos to be playing ball in all the day long, and I catch you down here. Jesus Christ. Well, I like to down there here, Bill said suddenly and defiantly. When we chum down here, nobody gives us any static. What he said, Mr. Nell asked Eddie. He said when he come down here, nobody gives us a static. Eddie said his voice was thin and whistling, but it was unapologetically firm. And he's right. When you guys like us go to the park and say we went to the baseball, the other guys say sure you want to be second base or third. Richie cackled. Eddie gets off a good one, and you are there. Mr. Nell swung his head to look at him. Richie shrugged. Sorry, but he's right. And Bill's right too. We like it down here. Richie thought Mr. Nell would become angry again at that, but the white-haired cop surprised him. Surprised them all with a smile. Aye, he said. I liked it down here myself as a boy, so I did, and I'm not forbidden ye. But hard to what I'm telling you now. He lifted a finger at them, and then all looked at him soberly. If ye come down here to play, ye come in a gang like ye are now, together. Do you understand me? They nodded. That means together all the time. No hide-and-seek games where ye splitting up, 1 and 1, 1 and 1. You all know what's going on in this town. All the same, I don't forbid you to come down here, mostly because you'd be down here anyway. But for your own good, here or anywhere around gang together. He looked at Bill. Do you disagree with me, young Master Bill Deprog? No, sir, Bill said. We'll stay together. That's good enough for me, Mr. Nell said. Your hand on it. Bill struck out of his hand, and Mr. Nell shook it. Richie shook off Stan and stepped forward. Sure, in Beprog, Mr. Nell, you're a prince among men. You are. And foreign man. A foreign man. He stuck out his own hand, seized the Irishman's huge paw, and flagged it fiercely, grinning all the time, to be amused. Mr. Nell, the boy, looked like a hideous parody of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Thank you, boy, Mr. Nell said, retrieving his hand. You want to work on that a bit. As of now, you sound about as Irish as Groucho Marx. The other boys laughed, mostly in relief, even as he was laughing. Stan shot Richie a reproachful look. Grow up, Richie. Mr. Nell shook hands all around Grip and Ben's last of all. Ye nothing to be amused of but bad judgments, big boy. As for that there. Did you see how to do it in the book? Ben shook his head. Just figure it out. Yes, sir. Well, if that don't beat Harry, you'll do great things someday. I've no doubt. But the Barrens isn't the place to do 'em. He looked around thoughtfully. No great will ever be done. Nary nasty place. He sighed. Tear it down, dear boys. Tear it right down. I believe I'll just sit me down in the shade to the bush here and bide a wee as you do it. He looked ironically at Richie as he said this last, as if inviting. Another manic outburst. Yes, sir, Richie said humbly, and that was all. Mr. Nell nodded satisfied, and the boys fell to work, once again turning to Ben, this time to show them the quickest way to tear down what he had shown them, how to build. Meanwhile, Mr. Nell removed a brown bottle from inside his tunic and helped himself to a large gulp. He coughed, then blew out breath in an explosive sigh, and regarding the boys with watery begun eyes. "And what might ye have in your bottle, sor?" Richie asked from the place where he was standing knee deep in the water. "Richie, can't you ever shut up?" Eddie hissed. This, Mr. Nell regarded Richie with mild surprise and looked at the bottle again. It had no label of any kind on it. "This is the cough medicine of the gods, my boy. Now let's see if you can bend your back. Bend your back anywhere, near as fast as you can. Wage your tongue. 3. Bill and Richie were walking up Witcham Street together later on. Bill was pushing Silver after fast building and then tearing down the dam. He simply did not have the energy it would have taken to get Silver up. The cruising speed, both boys were dirty, disbelief, and pretty well used up. Stan had asked them if they wanted to come over to his house and play Monopoly or Patrician or something, but none of them wanted to. It was getting late. Ben sounded tired and depressed, said he was going to go home and see if anybody had returned his library books. He had some hope of this, since the Derry librarian stood interested on written in the Barrow Street's address, as well as his names on each book's pocket card. Eddie said he was going to watch the rock show on TV because Neil Sedaka was going to be on, and he wanted to see if Neil Sedaka was a Negro. Stan told Eddie not to be so stupid. Neil Sedaka was white. You could tell he was white just listening to him. Eddie claimed you couldn't tell anything by listening to them. Until last year, he had been positively Chuck Berry was white, but when he was on bandstand, he turned out to be Negro. My mother still thinks he's white, so that's one good thing. Eddie said if she finds out he's a Negro, she probably won't let me listen to his songs anymore. Stan bet Eddie 4 funny bucks that Neela Seneca was white, and the two of them set off together for Eddie's house to settle his issue. And here were Bill and Richie headed in the direction which would bring them to Bill's house. After a while, neither of them talking much, Richie found himself thinking about Bill's story of the picture that had turned its head and wink, and in spite of his tiredness, an idea came to him. It was crazy, but it also held a certain attraction. "Billy, me boy," he said, "let's stop for a while. Take 5, I'm dead." "No such luck," Bill said. But he stopped, laid Silver carefully down on the edge of the green trinomial cylinder law, and the two boys sat on the wide stone steps which led up to the ramble and read Victor instructions. "What a day," Bill said glumly. There were dark purplish patches under his eyes. His face looked white and used. "You better call your house when we get to mine so your folks don't go bananas." "Yeah, you bet. Listen, Bill." Richie paused for a moment, thinking about Ben's mummy, Eddie's leper, and whatever Stan had almost told them. For a moment, something swam in his own mind, something about that Paul Bunyan statue out by the city center, but that had only been a dream. For God's sake, he pushed away such irrelevant thoughts and plugged. "Let's go up to your house. What do you say? Take a look in Georgie's room. I want to see that picture." Bill looked at Richie, shocked. He tried to speak, but could not. His stress was simply too great. He settled for shaking his hand vigorously. Richie said, "You heard Eddie's story and Ben's. Do you believe what they said?" "I don't know. I think they must have seen something." "Yeah, me too. All the kids that been killed around here, I think all of them would have had stories to tell too. The only differences between Ben and Eddie and those other kids is that Ben and Eddie didn't get caught." Bill raised his eyebrows, but showed no great surprise. Richie had supposed Bill would have taken it that far himself. He couldn't talk so good, but he was no dummy. So now dig on this while. "Big Bill," Richie said. "A guy could dress up in a clown suit and kill kids. I don't know why he'd want to, but nobody can tell why crazy people do things, right?" "Right. It's not that much different than the Joker in the Batman funny book. Just hearing his ideas out loud excited Richie. He wondered briefly if he was actually trying to prove something or just throwing up a smokescreen of words so he could see that room, that picture. In the end, it probably didn't matter. In the end, maybe just seeing Bill's eyes light up with their own excitement was enough. But where does the picture fit in? What do you think, Billy? In a low voice, not looking at Richie, Bill said he didn't think of it had anything to do with the murderers. I think it was Georgie's ghost. A ghost in a picture? Bill nodded. Richie thought about it. The idea of ghosts give his child's mind no trouble at all. He was sure there were such things. His parents were Mennonites and Richie's, went to church every Sunday, had to Thursday night Methodist youth fellowship meetings as well. He knew a great deal of the Bible already, and he knew the Bible believed in all sorts of weird stuff. According to the Bible, God himself was at least 1/3 ghost, and that was just the beginning. You could tell the Bible believed in demons because Jesus threw a bunch of them out of the sky. Real chuckling ones, too. When Jesus asked the guy who had them what his name was, the demons answered and told him to go join the Forging Legends, or something like that. The Bible believed in witches or else. Why wouldn't it say, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live"? Some of the stuff in the Bible was even better than the stuff in the horror comics. People getting boiled in oil or hanging themselves like Judas Iscariot. The story about how wicked King As fell off the tower, and all the dogs came and licked up his blood, the mass baby murders that had attempted the births of both Moses and Jesus Christ, guys who came out of their graves or flew into the air, soldiers who witched down walls, prophets who saw the future and fought monsters. All of that was in the Bible, and every word of it was true. So said Edith Craig, and so said Richie's folks. And so said Richie. It was perfectly willing to credit the possibility of Bill's explanation. It was logic which troubled him. But you said you were scared. Why would George's ghost want to scare you, Bill? Bill put a hand to his mouth and wiped it. The hand was trembling slightly. He's probably mad at me for getting him killed. It wasn't my fault. I sent him out with a... He was incapable of getting the word out, so he rocked his hand in the air instead. Richie nodded to show he would understand what Bill meant, but not to indicate agreement. "I don't think so," he said. "If you stabbed him in the back or shot him, that would be different. Or even if you, gave him a loaded gun that belonged to your dad to play with, and he shot himself with it. But it wasn't a gun. It was just a bow. You didn't want to hurt him, in fact." Richie raised one finger and waggled it at Bill in a louder way. "You just wanted the kid to have a little fun, right?" Bill fought back, fought desperately hard. What Richie had just said had made him feel better about George's death for the first time in months. But there was a part of him which insisted, with quiet firmness, that he was not supposed to feel better, of course. It was your fault. That part of him insisted, not entirely maybe, but at least partly. If not, how come there's that cold place on the couch between your mother and father? If not, how come no one ever says anything at the supper table anymore? Now it's just knives and forks rattling until you can't take it anymore. And ask if you... Excuse, please. It was as if he were the ghost, a prisoner that spoke and moved, but was not quite heard or seen, a thing vaguely sensed, but still not accepted as real. He did not like the thought that he was to blame, but the only alternative he could think of to explain their behavior was much worse. That all the love and attention his parents had given him before had somehow been the results of Georgie's persistence, and with George gone, there was nothing for him, and all of that had happened at random, for no reason at all. And if you put your ear to that door, you could hear the winds of madness blowing outside. So we went over what he had done and felt and said on the day Georgie had died. Part of him hoping that what Richie had said was true. Part of him hoping just as hard it was not. He hadn't been a saint of a big brother to George, That much was certain. They had had fights, plenty of them. Surely there had been one that day. No fights, for one thing. Bill himself had still been feeling too punked to work up to a really good quarrel with George. He had been sleeping, dreaming about some turtle. Funny little animal. He couldn't remember just what in had awakened to the sound of diminishing rain outside, and George muttering unhappily to himself in the dining room. He asked George what was wrong. George came in and said he was trying to make a paper boat from directions in the best book of activities, but it kept coming out wrong. Bill told George to bring his book and sit in next to Richie on the steps leading up to the cemetery. He remembered how George's eyes lit up when the paper boat came out right, and how good that look had made him feel like Georgie thought he was a real hot shit. A straight shooter, the guy who could do it until it got done, making him feeling short, like a big brother. The boat had killed Georgie, but Richie was right. It had been like handing George a loaded gun to play with. Bill hadn't known what was going to happen. No way. He could. He drew a deep, stuttering breath, feeling something like a rock, something he hadn't even known was there, go rolling off his chest. All at once, he felt better about everything. He opened his mouth to tell Richie this and burst into tears instead. Alarmed Richie put an arm around Bill's shoulders after taking a quick glance around to make sure no one who might mistake them for a couple of Falcons was looking. "You're okay," he said. "You okay, Billy, right? Come on, turn off the waterworks. I didn't want him to get killed," Bill sobbed. "That isn't on my mind at all." "Christ, Bill, I know it wasn't," Richie said. "If you wanted to scrub him, you would have pushed him downstairs or something." Richie patted Bill's shoulder clumsily and gave him a hard little hug before letting him go. "Come on, quit bawling, okay? You sound like a baby." Little by little, Bill had stopped. He still hurt, but this hurt seemed cleaner, as if he had cut himself open and taken something that was rotten inside him. And that feeling of relief was still there. "I didn't want to get him killed," Bill repeated. "And if you tell anybody I was crying, I'll bust your nose." "I won't tell," Richie said. "Don't worry. He was your brother, for gosh sake. If my brother got killed, I cried my fucking head off. You don't have to have a brother." "Yeah, but what if I did?" "You would?" "Of course," Richie paused, fixing Bill with a wary eye, trying to decide if Bill was really over it. He was still wiping his red eyes with his snot rag, but Richie had decided he probably was. "All I meant was that I don't know why George would want to haunt you, so maybe the pictures got something to do with." "Well, with that other, the clown, maybe. George doesn't know. Maybe he thinks." Richie understood what Bill was trying to say and waved it aside. "After you croak, you know everything people ever thought about you, Big Bill." He spoke with the intelligent air of a great teacher, correcting a country bumpkins, fanatical ideas. "It's in the Bible. It says, yeah, even though we can't see too much in the mirror right now, we will see, though, through it like it was a window after we died. That's in First Telemedicine or Second Babylonicus. I forget which it means. I see what it means," Bill said. "So what do you say, huh? Let's go up to his room and take a look. Maybe we'll get a clue about who's killing all the kids." "I'm scared too." "I am too," Richie said, thinking it was just more sand, something to say that would get Bill moving, and then something heavy turned over in his midsection, and he discovered it was true. He was scared. Green. 4. The two boys slipped into Deprog's house like ghosts. Bill's father was still at work. Sharon Deprog was in the kitchen, reading a paperback at the kitchen table. The smell of the supper, cod fish, drifted out into the front hall. Richie called home so his mom would know he wasn't dead. Just at Bill's, someone there. Mrs. Deprog called as Richie put the phone down. They froze, eyeing each other guilty. Then Bill called me, Mom, and Richie Torzor, ma'am, Richie yelled. "Hello, Richie," Mrs. Deprog called back, her voice disconnected almost not there at all. Would you like to stay for supper? Thanks, ma'am, but my mom's gonna pick me up in half an hour or so. Tell her I said hello, won't you? Yes, ma'am, I sure will. Come on, Bill whispered. That's enough small talk. They went upstairs and down the hall to Bill's room. It was boy-neat, which Minute would have given the mutter of the boy in question. Only a mild headache to look at. The shelves were stuffed with a helter-skelter collection of books and comics. There were more comics, plus a few models, and toys in a stack of 45s on the desk. There was also an old Underwood office model typewriter on it. His folks had given it to him for Christmas 2 years ago, and Bill sometimes wrote stories on it. He did this as a bit more frequently since George's death. The pretending seemed to ease his mind. There was a photograph on the floor across from the bed with a pile of folded clothes stacked on the lid. Bill put the clothes in the drawers of his bureau and then took the records from the desk. He shuffled through them, picking half a dozen. He put them on the photograph's fat spindle and turned the machine on. The Fleetwoods started singing, "Come softly, darling." Richie held his nose. Bill grinned in spite of his thumping heart. "They don't like rock and roll," he said. "They gave me this one for my birthday. Also, two Pat Boone records and Tommy Sands. I keep a little Richard and Scrummagin, Jay Hawkins, for when they're not here. If she hears the music, she'll think we're in my room. Come on." George's room was across the hall. The door was shut. Richie looked at it and licked his lips. "They don't keep it locked," he whispered to Bill. Suddenly, he found himself hoping it was locked. Suddenly, he was having trouble believing this had been his idea. Bill, his face pale, shook his head and turned the knob. He stepped in and looked back at Richie. After a moment, Richie followed. Bill shut the door behind them, muffling the Fleetwoods. Richie jumped a little at the soft snick of the latch. He looked around, fearful and instantly curious at the same time. The first thing he noticed was the dry musicians of the air. No one's opened a window in here for a long time. He thought, heck, no one's breathed in here for a long time. That's really what he feels like. He stuttered a little at the thought and licked his lips again. His eyes fell on George's bed, and he thought of George sleeping now under a comfort and a verve in Mount Hope Cemetery, rotting there, his hands not folded because you needed two hands to do the old folding routine. And George had been buried with only one. A little sound escaped Richie's throat. Bill turned and looked at him inquiringly. "You're right," Richie said huskily. "It's spooky in here. I don't see how you could stand to come alone." "He was my brother," Bill said simply. "Sometimes I want to. Is it all?" There were posters on the walls, little kids' posters. One showed Tom Terrific, the cartoon character on Captain Kangaroo's program. Tom was springing over the head and clutching hands of Crabby Appleton, who was, of course, rotten to the core. Another showed Donald Duck's nephew, Huey, Louie, and Dewey, marching off into the wilderness in their junior woodchucks, crooks, and caps. A third, which George had colored himself, showed Mr. Dew holding up traffic so a bunch of little kids headed for school could cross the street. "Mr. Dew says wait for the crossing guard," it said underneath. Kid wasn't too cool about saying in the lines. Richie thought and then stuttered. The kid was never going to get any better at it either. Richie looked at the table up by the window. Mrs. Deprog had stood up all of George's rank cards there, half open, looking at them, knowing there would never be more, knowing that George had died before he could stay in the lines, when he colored, knowing his life had ended incurably and internally, with only those few kindergartens and first ranks. All the idiot's truth of death crunched home to Richie for the first time. It was as if a large iron safe had fallen into his brains and buried itself there. "I could die." His mind screamed at them, suddenly in tones of betrayed horror. Anybody could. Anybody could. "Boy, oh boy," he said in a shaky voice. He could manage no more. "Yeah," Bill said in a near whisper. He sat down on George's bed. "Look." Richie followed Bill's pointed finger and saw the photo album lying closed on the floor. "My photographs," Richie read. George Elmer Debrog, age 6. Age 6. His mind shrank in those same tones of shrill betrayal. Age 6 forever. Anyone could. Shit. Fucking anybody. It was open, Bill said, but before. So it closed, Richie said uneasily. He sat down on the bed beside Bill looked at the photo album. Lots of books closed on their own. The pages, maybe not the cover. It closed itself. He looked at Richie solemnly, his eye very dark on his pale, tired face. But he wants you to open it up again. That's what I think. Richie got up and walked slowly over the photograph album. It laid at the base of the window, screened with light curtains. Looking out, he could see the apple tree in the Debrog backyard and swing rock slowly back and forth from one garnered black limb. He looked down at George's book again, and dried maroon stain colored the thickness of the pages in the middle of the book. It could have been old ketchup. Sure, it was easy enough to see George looking at his photo album while eating a hot dog or a big sloppy hamburger. He takes a big bite and some ketchup squirts out onto the book. Little kids were always doing cinnamons, stuff like that. It could be ketchup, but Richie knew it was not. He touched the album briefly and then drew his hand away. It felt cold. It had been lying in a place where the strong summer sunlight, only slightly filtered by those little curtains, would have been falling on it all day. But it felt cold. Well, I'll just leave it alone, Richie thought. I don't want to look at his stupid old album anyway. Seeing a lot of people I don't know, I think maybe I'll tell Bill I changed my mind, and we can go to his room and read comics books for a while, and then I'll go home and eat supper and go to bed early because I'm pretty tired. And when I wake up tomorrow morning, I'll be sure that stuff was just ketchup. That's just what I'll do. Yowza. So we opened the album with hands and seemed 1,000 miles away from him, at the end of long plastic arms, and he looked at the faces and places in George's album, the aunts and the uncles, and the Babites, the houses, the old Fords, and stud bakers, the telephone lines, the mailboxes, the picket fences, the wheelnuts with muddy water in them, the Ferris wheel at the East County Fair, the standpipe, the ruins of the Kitchener Ironworks. His fingers flipped faster and faster, and suddenly the pages were blank. He turned back, not wanting to but able to help himself. Here was a picture of downtown Derry Main Street and Canal Street from around 1930, and beyond it there was nothing. There's no school picture of George in here, Richie said. He looked at Bill with a mixture of relief and expression. What kind of line were you handing me, Big Bill? What? This picture of downtown in the olden days is the last one in the book. All the rest of the pages are blank. Bill got off the bed and joined Richie. He looked at the picture of downtown Derry as it had been almost 30 years ago. Old-fashioned cars and trucks, old-fashioned streetlights, with clustering in globes like big white grapes, pestering by the canal caught. In the mid-strayed by the click of the stutter. He turned the page, just as Richie had said there was nothing. No, wait, not quite nothing. There was one studio corner, the some sort of item you used to mount in photographs. It was here, he said and tapped the studio corner. Look, jeepers, what do you think happened to it? I don't know. Bill had taken the album from Richie and was now holding it on his own lap. He turned back for the pages, looking for Georgie's picture. He gave up after a minute, but the pages did not. They turned themselves, flipping slowly but steadily, with big, duplicate, riffling sounds. Bill and Richie look at each other, wide-eyed, and then back down and arrive at the last picture again, and the pages stopped turning. Here was downtown Derry and Subbatones, the city as it had been long before either Bill or Richie had been born. Say, Richie said suddenly and took the album back from Bill. There was no fear in his voice now, and his face was suddenly full of wonder. Holy shit! Well, what? What is it? Us! That's what it is. It is. Holy Jesus Crow, look! Bill took one side of the book, bent over it, sharing it. They looked like boys at chore practice. Bill drew in breath sharply, and Richie knew he had seen it too. Caught under the shiny surface of his old black and white photograph. Two small boys were walking along Main Street toward the point where Main and Center intersected. the point where the canal went underground for a mile and a half or so. The two boys showed up, clearly against the low currents and wall at the edge of the canal. One was wearing kickers. The other was wearing something that looked almost like a sailor suit. A tween cap was perched on his head. They were turned in the three quarters profile toward the camera, looking at something on the far side of the street. The boy in the kickers was Richie Torsor beyond a doubt, and a boy in the sailor suit and the tweed cap was Stuttering Bill. They started at themselves in a picture almost 3 times as old as they were, hypnotized. The inside of Richie's mouth suddenly felt as dry as dust and as smooth as glass. A few steps ahead of the boys in the pictures, there was a man holding the brim of the veteran, his top coat frozen forever as it flapped out behind him in a sudden gust of wind. There were Model Ts on the street, a person aero coverts with running boards. I don't believe, Bill began, and that was when the picture began to move. The Model T that should have remained internally in the middle of the intersection, or at least until the chemicals in the old photo finally dissolved completely, passed through it, a haze of exhaust puffing out of its tailpipes. It went on toward up Mile Hill. A small white hand shot out of the driver's side window and signaled a left turn. It swung onto Court Street and passed beyond the photo's white border, and so out of sight. The picture arrowed the Cleveland backyards. They all begun to roll along, dodging their separate ways through the intersection. After 28 years, or so the skirt of the man's top coat finally finished its flap. He settled his hat more firmly on his head and walked on. The two boys completely their turn, come in full face, and a moment later Richie saw what they had been looking at. A mangy dog came trotting across Center Street. The boy in the sailor suit, Bill, raised 2 fingers to the corners of his mouth and whistled, stunned beyond any ability to move or think. Richie realized he could hear the whistle, could hear the cars, internally sewing machines, engines. The sound were faint, like sounds heard through thick glass, but they were there. The dogs glanced toward the two boys. They trotted on. The boys glanced at each other and laughed like chipmunks. They started to walk on, and then to Richie, it kickers, grabbed Bill's arms and pointed toward the canal. They turned in that direction. No, Richie fought. Don't do that. Don't. They went to the lower crimson wall, and suddenly the clown popped up over its edge like a horrible Jack-in-the-Box, a clown with George's Deprog's face, his hair slicked back, his mouth a hideous grin full of bleed and grist paint, his eyes black holes. One hand clutched 3 balloons on a string. With the other he reached for the boy in the sailor suit and seized his neck. No! Bill cried and reached into the picture. Stop it, Bill, Richie shouted and grabbed it for him. He was almost too late. He saw the tips of Bill's fingers go through the surface of the photograph and into the other world. He saw the fingertips go from the warm pink of living flesh to the mummified cream color that passed for white in old photos. At the same time, they become small and disconnected. It was like the particular optical illusions one sees when one thrusts a hand into the glass bowl of water. The part of the hand underwater seemed to be afloat in Dismolibodian, inches away from the part which is still out of the water, and series of diagonal cuts slashed across Bill's fingers at the point. Were they cased being his fingers and become photo fingers? It was as if he had stuck his hands into the blades of a fan instead of into a picture. Richie seized his forearm and gave a tremendous yank. They both fell over. Georgie's album hit the floor and snapped itself shut with a dry clap. Bill stuck his fingers in his mouth. Tears of pain stood in his eyes. Richie could see blood running down his palm to his wrists in thin streams. Let me see, he said. Her hurts, Bill said. He held his hand out to Richie, palm down. There were ladder-like slash cuts running up his index, second, and third fingers. The pinky had barely touched the surface of the photograph, if it had a surface, and although that finger had not been cut, Bill told Richie later that the nail had been neatly clipped, as if with a pair of manicurist scissors. Jesus, Bill, Richie said. Band-Aids. That was all he could think of. God, they had been lucky. If he hadn't pulled Bill's arm when he did, his fingers might have been amputated instead of just badly cut. We got to fix those up. Your mother can't... Never mind, my mother, Bill said. He grabbed the photo album again, spilling drops of blood on the floor. Don't open that again, Richie cried, grabbing fastidiously at Bill's shoulder. Jesus Christ. Billy, you almost lost your finger. Bill shook them off. He flipped through the pages, and there was a grim demonstration on his face that scared Richie more than anything else. Bill's eyes looked almost mad. His wounded fingers printed George's album with new blood. It didn't look like ketchup. Yeah, but when it had a little time to dry, it would. Of course it would. And here was the down scene again. The Model T stood in the middle of the intersection. The other cars were frozen in the places where they had been before. The man walking toward the intersection held the brim of the fountain. His coat once more belled out in a mid-flap. The two boys were gone. There were no boys in the picture anywhere. But look, Richie whispered and pointed. He was careful to keep the tip of his fingers away from the picture. An arc showed just over the low considerate wall at the edge of the canal, the top of something round, something like a balloon. 5. They got out of George's room just in time. Bill's mother was a voice at the foot of the stairs, in the shadow on the wall. Have you boys been wrestling? She asked sharply. I heard a thud. Just a little, Mom. Bill threw a sharp glance at Richie. Be quiet, it said. Well, I want you to stop it. I thought the ceiling was going to come right down on my head. We will. They heard her go back toward the front of the house. Bill had wrapped his handkerchief around his bleeding hand. It was turning red and in a moment would start to drip. The boys went down to the bathroom where Bill held his hand under the factory until the bleeding stopped, cleaned the cuts, looked thin, but surely deep, looking at their white lips and the red meat just inside them made Richie feel sick to his stomach. He wrapped them with Band-Aids as fast as he could. Hurts like hell, Bill said. Well, why do you want to go and put your hand in there? You wet end. Bill looked solemnly at the rings of Band-Aids of his fingers, then up at Richie. It was a clown, he said. It was the clown pretending to be George. That's right, Richie said, like it was the clown pretending to be the mummy when Ben saw it. Like it was the clown pretending to be that sick bum that he saw. The leper, right, but it is really the clown. It's a monster, Richie said flatly. Some kind of monster. Some kind of monster right here in Derry. And it's killing kids. 6. On a Saturday not long after the incident of the dam and the barrens, Mr. Nail in the picture that moved, Richie, Ben, and Beverly Marsh, came face to face with not one monster, but 2, and they paid to do it. Richie did anyway. These monsters were scary, but not really dangerous. They stalked their victims on the screen of the Aladdin Theater, with Richie, Ben, and Bev watched from the balcony. One of the monsters was a werewolf played by Michael Landon, and he was cool because even when he was the werewolf, he still had sort of duck's ass haircut. Other was the smashed up Hotteride, played by Gray Conway. He was brought back to life by a descendant of Victor Frankenstein, who fed all parts he didn't need to, but a bunch of alligators he kept in the basement. Also on the program, a movie tone new steel that showed the latest Paris fashions and the latest Vanguard rocket explosions on Cape Carnival, 2 Warner Brothers cartoons, 1 Popeye cartoon, and a Chilly Willy cartoon. For some reason, that hat Chilly Willy always cracked up Richie up, and previews of coming attraction. The coming attraction including 2 pictures Richie immediately put on his gotta-see list. I Married a Monster from Outer Space and The Blob. Ben was very quiet during the show. Ole Haystack had nearly been spotted by Henry, Belch, and Victor earlier, and Richie amused that was all that was troubling him. Ben, however, had forgotten all about the creeps. They were sitting close to the screen, down below, chucking popcorn boxes at each other and hooting. Beverly was the reason for his silence. Her nearness was so overwhelming that he was almost ill with it. His body would break out in the goosebumps, and then, if she should so much as shift in her seat, his skin would flash hot, as it would a tropical fever, when her hand brushed his reaching for the popcorn. He trembled with exhilaration. He thought later that those 3 hours in the dark next to Beverly had been both the longest and shortest hours of his life. Richie, unaware that Ben was in deep throes of calf love, was feeling just as fine as paint. In his book, the only thing any better than a couple of Francis the Talking Mule pictures was a couple of horror pictures in a theater filled with kids, all of them yelling and screaming at the gory parts. He currently did not connect any of them going-ons. And the 2 low-budget American International pictures they were watching with that was going on in town. Not then, at least. He had seen the Twin Shock show Saturday, Maiden ad, in the news on Friday morning, and had almost immediately forgotten how badly he had slept the night before and how he had finally gotten up and turned on the light in his closet. A real baby trick for sure, but he hadn't been able to get a wink of sleep until he'd done it. But by the following morning things had seemed normal again. Well, almost. He began to think that maybe he and Bill had just shared an hallucination. Of course, the cuts on Bill's fingers weren't a hallucination, but maybe they'd just been paper cuts from some of the sheets in the Georgie's album. Pretty thick paper. Could have been maybe besides. There was no law saying he had to spend the next 10 years thinking about it, was there? Nope, and so following experience that might well have sent an adult running for the nearest head shrinking. Richie Torzor got up, ate a giant pancake breakfast, saw the ad for the 2 horror movies on the amusement pages of the paper, checked his funds, found them a little low, well, non-existence might actually have been a better word, and began to pester his father for chores. His dad, who had come to table already wearing his white dentist's tunic, but down the sports pages and poured himself a second cup of coffee. He was a pleasant-looking man with a rather thin face. He wore steel-rimmed spectacles, was developing a bald spot at the back of his head, and would die of cancer of the latex in 1973. He looked at the ad to which Richie was pointing. Horror movies, Wentworth Torzor said. Yeah, Richie said, grinning. Feel like you have to go, went down Torzor said. Yeah, feel like you'll probably die in a convulsion of disappointment if you don't get to see those 2 trashy movies. Yeah, I would. I know I would. Gah. Richie fell out of his chair onto the floor, clutching his throat, his tongue sticking out. This was Richie's admiringly particular way of turning on the charm. Oh, God, Richie, will you please stop it? His mother asked him from the stove, where she was frying him a couple of eggs to top off the pancakes. Gee, Richie, his father said as Richie got back into his chair. I guess I must have forgotten to pay you your allowance on Monday. That's only the reason I can think of for you needing more money on Friday. Well, gone. Well, that's extremely deep subject for a boy with such a shallow mind, Wentworth Torzor said. He put his elbow on the table and then cupped his chin on the palm of his hand, regarded his only son, what appeared to be deep fascination. Where'd it go? Richie immediately fell into the voice of Toodles, the English butler. Why, I spent it, didn't I, Governor? Pip, pip, cheerio, and all that rot. My part of the war effort. All got to do our bit to beat back the bloody Hun, don't we? Bit of sticky wicky, ain't what? Bit of a wet hedgehog, what? Bit of a pile of bullshit. Went sad adamantly and reached for the strawberry pervicens. Spare me the vigorously of the breakfast table, if you please, Margaret Torzor said to her husband as she brought Richie's eggs over to the table. And to Richie, I don't know why you want to fill your head up with such awful junk anyway? Ah, Mom, Richie said. He was outwardly crushed, inwardly, germinally. He could read both of his parents like books, well-worn and well-loved books, and he was pretty sure he was going to get what he wanted, chores and permission to go to the show Saturday afternoon. Went leaned forward toward Richie and smiled widely. I think I have you right where I want you, he said. Is that right, Dad? Richie said and smiled back and trifled uneasily. Oh, yes, you know our lawn, Richie. You are familiar with our lawn. Indeed I am, Governor, Richie said. Becoming Toodles again, or trying to beat Shaggy a want. Want one, Went agreed. And you, Richie, will reminded that condition. I will. You will mow it, Richie. Okay, Dad, sure, Richie said, but a terrible suspicion had suddenly blossomed in his mind. Maybe his dad didn't mean just the front lot. Wentworth Torzor smiled, widened into a particularly shark's grin. All of it, oh idiot, child of my Lawrence, front, back, sides, and when you finish, I will cross your palm with 2 green pieces of paper with the likeness of George Washington on one side and a picture of a pyramid open and attentive with the ever-watching ocular on the other. I don't get you, Dad, Richie said, but he wasn't afraid he did. $2. $2 for the whole lawn, Richie cried, genuinely wounded. It's the biggest lawn on the block. Geez, Dad. Went sighed and picked the paper up again. Richie could read the front page headline. Missing boy props it. New fears. He thought briefly of George Debrow's strange scrapbook, but that had surely been an hallucination, and even if it hadn't been, that was yesterday, and this was today. Guess you didn't want to see those movies. As bad as you thought, Went said from behind the paper. A moment later, his eyes appeared over the top. Studying Richie, studying him a trifle, smuggling in truth, studying him the way a man with fourth of a kind studies his poker opponent over the fan of his cards. When the Clark twins do it all. You give them $2 each. That's true, Went amended it, but as far as I know, they won't want to go to the movies tomorrow, or if they do, they must have funds sufficient to the occasion, because they hadn't popped by to check the state of the hurricane surrounding our Dolphin lately. You, on the other hand, do want to go and find yourself lacking the funds to do so. That pressure you feel in your midsection, maybe the 5 pancakes and 2 eggs you ate for breakfast, Richie, or it may just be the barrels. I have you over. Want? Went's eyes, suspicious behind the paper again. He's blackmailing me, Richie said to his mother, who was eating dry toast. She was trying to lose her weight again. This is blackmail. I just hope you know that. Yes, dear, I know that, his mother said. There's eggs on your chin. Richie wiped the eggs off his chin. $3 if I had it all. Done when you get home tonight. He asked the newspaper. His father's eyes appeared again briefly. $2.50. Oh, man, Richie said. You and Jack Benny. My idol, Went said from behind the paper. Make up your mind, Richie. I want to read these box scores. Deal, Richie said and sighed. When your folks had you by the balls, they really knew how to squeeze. It was pretty chuckly when you fought it over. As he mowed, he practiced his voices. 7. He finished front, back, and sides by 3 o'clock Friday afternoon and began Saturday with $2.50 in his jeans. Pretty damn near thundering. He called Bill up, but Bill told him grimly that he had to go up to Bangor and take some kind of speech therapy test. Richie sympathized and then added in his best stuttering Bill voice, Give me help, Big Bill. You're facing my butt, Torzor, Bill said, and hung up. He called Eddie Kasprak next, but Eddie sounded even more depressed than Bill. His mother had gotten them each a full day bus pass, he said, and they were going to visit Eddie's aunts in Haven and Bangor and Hampton. All 3 of them were fat like Mrs. Kasprak, and all three of them were single. They'll all pitch my cheek and tell me how much I've grown, Eddie said. That's 'cause they know how cute you are, Eds, just like me. I saw what a cutie you were the first time I met you. Sometimes you're really a turd, Richie. It takes to one it takes one to know one, Eds, and you know 'em all. You gonna be down in the Barrens next week? I guess so, if you guys are. Want to play guns, maybe? But I think me and Big Bill have gotten something to tell you. What? It's really Bill's story, I guess. I'll see you. Enjoy your aunts. Very funny. His third call was to Stan the man, but Stan was in Dutch with his folks for breaking their pictures window. He had been playing flyer saucer with a pie plate, and it took a bad bank cash rash. He had to do chores all weekend and probably next weekend to Richie Cadmitterson, and then asked Stan if he would be coming down to Barron's next week. Stan said he guessed so, if his father didn't decide to ground him or something. Gee, Stan, it was just a window, Richie said. Yeah, but a big one, Stan said, and hung up. Richie started to leave the living room, then thought of Ben Hanscom. He tumbled through the telephone book and found a listing for an Alleran Hanscoms, since she was the only Lady Hanscom among the four listed. Richie figured it had to be Ben's number and called. I'd like to go, but I already spent my allowance, Ben said. He sounded depressed and ashamed by the admission. He had, in fact, spent it all on candy, soda chips, and beef jerky strips. Richie, who was rolling in dough and who didn't like to go to movies alone, said, I got plenty of money. You can give me Owens. Yeah, really? You do that? Sure, Richie said, puzzled. Why not? Okay, Ben said happily. Okay, that'd be great. 2 horror movies. Did you say one was a werewolf picture? Yeah. Man, I love werewolf pictures. Geez, Haystack, don't wet your pants. Ben laughed. I'll see you out in the front of Aladdin, okay? Yeah, great. Richie hung up and looked at the phone thoughtfully. It suddenly occurred to him that Ben Hanscom was lonely, and that in turn made him feel rather heroic. He was whistling as he ran upstairs to get some comics to read before the show. 8. The day was sunny, breezy and cool. Richie jived along Center Street toward the Aladdin, popping his fingers and singing Rockin' Robin under his breath. He was feeling good. Going to the movies always made him feel good. He loved that magic world, those dreams. He felt sorry for anyone who had dull duties to discharge on such a day. Bill with his speech therapy, Eddie with his aunts, poor old Stan the man who would be spending the afternoon scraping down the front porch steps or sweeping the garage because the pie plate he'd been throwing around swept right when it was supposed to sweep left. Richie had his yo-yo tucked in his back pocket, and now he took it out and tried again to get it to sleep. This was an ability Richie lusted to acquire, but so far, no soap. The crazy little fucker just wouldn't do it. Either it went down and popped right back up, or it went down and dropped dead at the end of its string. Halfway up Center Street Hill, he saw a girl in the bench-plaited skirt in a white sleeveless blouse sitting on the bench outside Shook's drugstore. She was eating what looked like a pistachio ice cream cone. Red right Albert hair, its highlight seemed property or something, almost blonde, hung down to her shoulder blades. Richie knew only one girl with hair of that particular shade. It was Beverly Marsh. Richie liked Bev a lot. Well, he liked her, but not that way. He admired her looks. He knew he wasn't alone. Girls like Sally Mullerdern and Greta Bowie hated Beverly like fire, still too young to understand how they could have everything else so easily, and still have to compete in the matter of looks with a girl who lived in one of those slummy apartments on Lower Main Street. But mostly he liked her because she was tough and had a really good sense of humor. Also, they usually had cigarettes. He liked her, in short, because she was a good guy. Still, he had once or twice caught himself wondering what color underwear she was wearing under her small selection of rather faded skirts. And that was not the sort of thing you wondered about the other guys, was it? And Richie had to admit she was one hell of a pretty guy. Approaching the bench where she sat eating her ice cream, Richie belted an invisible topcoat around his middle, pulled down an invisible slouch hat, and pretended to be Humphrey Bogart, adding the concert voice. He became Humphrey Bogart, at least to himself. To others, he would have sounded like Richie Torzler with a mild head cold. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, gliding up to the bench where she was sitting and looking out of the traffic. "No sense waiting for a bus here. The Navage have cut off our retreat. The last plane left at midnight. You be on it. He needed you, sweetheart. So do I, but I'll get along somehow." "Hi, Richie," Bev said. And when she turned toward him, he saw a purple, blackish bruise on her right cheek, like the shadow of a crow's wing. He was again struck by her good looks. Only it occurred to him now that she might actually be beautiful. It had never really occurred to him until that moment that there might be beautiful girls outside of the movies, or that he himself might known one. Perhaps it was the bruise that allowed him to see the possibilities of her beauty, an essential contrast, a particular flaw which first drew attention to itself, and then somehow defined the rest of the gray blues, the nourishing red lips, the creamy, unballisted child skin. There was a tiny spray of freckles across her nose. "See anything green?" she asked, tossing her head prettily. "You, sweetheart," Richie said. "We've turned green ash limiter cheese, but when we get you of the Calima Blackula, you're going into a fish and hospital money can buy. Will turn you white again. I swear it on my mother's name." "You're an asshole, Richie. That doesn't sound like Hypno or Bogart at all." But she smiled a little as she said it. Richie sat down next to her. "You're going to the movies?" "I don't have any money," she said. "Can I see your yo-yo?" He handed it over. "I had to take it back," he told her. "It's supposed to sleep, but it doesn't. I got japped." She poked her finger through the loop of string, and Richie pushed his glasses on the bridge of his nose so he could watch that what she was doing better. She turned her hand over, palm toward the sky, the Dukan yo-yo tucked neatly into the valley of flesh formed by her cupped hand. She rolled the yo-yo off her index finger. It went down to the end of its string and fell asleep. When she twitched her finger in a come-on gesture, it probably woke up and climbed its string to her palm again. "Oh, bug dung, looked at that," Richie said. "That's kid stuff," Bev said. "Watch this." She snapped the yo-yo down again. She let it sleep for a moment and then walked the dog with its smart series of snap jerks up, the string to her hand again. "Oh, stop it," Richie said. "I hate show-offs." "Or how about this?" Bev asked, smiling sweetly. She got the yo-yo going back in front, making the red wooden Dukan look like a bolo bouncer Richie had once. She finished with 2 around the worlds, almost hitting a shuffle old lady who glared at them. The yo-yo ended up in her palm, its string neatly rolled around its spindle. Bev handed it back to Richie and sat down on the bench again. Richie sat down next to her, his jaw hanging agape in perfectly unaffected admission. Bev looked at him and giggled. "Shut your mouth, you're drawing flies." Richie shut his mouth with a snap. "Besides, the last part was just luck. First time in my life I did 2 around the world in a row without fizzing out." Kids were walking past them now, on their way to show Peter Gordon. Walk by with marker and freighted. they were supposed to be going together, but Richie figured it was just that they lived next door to each other on West Broadway and were such a couple of assholes that they needed each other's support and attention. Peter Gordon was already getting a pretty good crop of aunts, although he was only 12. He sometimes hung around with Bowers, Chris, and Huggins, but he wasn't quite brave enough to try anything on his own. He glanced over at Richie and Bev sitting together on the bench and chanted, Richie and Beverly up in a tree. Kansky. First comes love, then comes marriage, and here comes Richie with a baby carriage. Marcerin finished in crawling laughter. Sit on this dear heart, Bev said, and winked the finger on them. Marcerin looked away, disgusted, as if she could not believe any more. She could be so uncoughed. Gordon slipped an arm around her and called back over his shoulder to see Richie. Maybe I'll see you later, Four Eyes. Maybe you'll see your mother, Grindelwald, Richie responded smartly, if a little censorily. Beverly collapsed with laughter. She leaned against Richie's shoulder for a moment, and Richie had just time to reflect that her touch and sensation of her lighting carried weight was not exactly unpleasant. Then she sat up again. What a pair of jerks, she said. Yeah, I think Maurice Fadden peas rose water, Richie said, and Beverly got the giggles again. Channel number 5, she said, her voice muffled because her hands were over her mouth. You bet, said Richie, although he hadn't slightly idea what channel number 5 was. Bev, what? Can you show me how to make a sleep? I guess so. I never tried to show anyone. How do you learn it? Who showed you? Showed you. She gave me a disgusted look. No one showed me. I just figured it out. Like a troll in a baton. I'm great at that, not considering your family, Richie said, rolling his eyes. Well, I am, she says. But I didn't take classes or anything. You really can twirl? Sure. Probably be a cheerleader in junior high, huh? She smiled. It was a kind of smile Richie had never seen before. It was a wise circle and sad all the time. He recoiled a little from its unknown power, as he had recoiled from the picture of downtown in Georgie's album, when it had begun to move. That's for girls like Maureen Fadden, she said. Her and Sally Muller and Greta Bowie. Girls who peed rosewater. Their fathers helped to buy the sports equipment and the uniforms. They got in. I'll never be a cheerleader. Geez, Bev, that's no attitude to take. Sure it is. If it's the truth, she shrugged. I don't care. Who wants to do some salts and show your underwear to 1 million people anyway? Look, Richie, watch this. For the next 10 minutes, she worked on showing Richie how to make his yo-yo sleep. Near the end, Richie actually began to get the hang of it, although he could usually get it to come halfway up the string after walking it up. You're not jerking your fingers hard enough, that's all, she said. Richie looked at the clock on the urinal trussed across the street and jumped up, stuffing his yo-yo into his back pocket. Jeepers, I gotta go. I gotta get going, Bev. I'm supposed to meet old Haystack. He'll think I changed my mind or something. Who's Haystack? Oh, Ben Hanscom. I call him Haystack, though. You know, like Haystack Cologne, the wrestler. Ben frowned at him. That's not very nice. I like Ben. Don't want me, massa, Richie screeched in his peckling voice, rolling his eyes and flapping his hands. Don't want me. I's Gretter be a good danky man. Richie, Bev said thinly. Richie quit it. I liked him, too, he said. We all built a dam down in the Barrens a couple of days ago. And you go down there? You and Ben play down there? Sure, a bunch of guys do. It's sort of cool down there. Richie glanced at the clock again. I really got to split for the scene. Bell'll be waiting, okay? He paused, said, if you're not doing anything, come with me. I told you, I don't have any money. I'll pay your way. I got a couple of bucks. She tossed the remains of her ice cream cone in a nearby litter barrel. Her eyes, that fine clear shade of blue-gray, turned up to his. They were coldly amused. She pretended to primp her hair and ask him, oh dear, am I being asked out on a date? For a moment, Richie was unintentionally flustered. He actually felt a blush rising in his cheek. He had made the offer in a perfectly natural way. just as he had made it to Ben. Except, hadn't he said something to Ben about Owisen? Yes, but he hadn't said anything about Owisen to Beverly. Richie suddenly felt a bit weird. He had dropped his eyes, retreating from her amused glance, and realized now that her skirt had rightened up a bit when she shifted forward to drop the ice cream cone in a litter barrel, and he could see her knees. He raised his eyes, but that was no help. Now he was looking at the beginning, swells of her bosom. Richie, as he usually did in such moments of confusion, took refuge in alternately. Yes, a date, he screamed, throwing himself on his knees before her and holding his collapsed hands up. Please come, please come. I shall ready kill meself. If you say no, I won't. Oh, Richie, you're such a fuzzbrain, she said, giggling again, but weren't her cheeks also a trifle flushed? If so, it made her look prettier than ever. Get up before you get arrested. He got up and plopped down beside her again. He felt as if he was accordingly had returned. A little foolishness always helped when you had a dizzy spell, he believed. You want to go? Sure, she said. Thank you very much. Think of it. My first date. Just wait until I write it in my diary tonight. She clasped her hands together between her button breasts, fluttered her eyelashes rapidly, and then laughed. I wish you stopped calling it that, Richie said. She sighed. You don't have much romance in your soul. Damn right I don't, but he felt somehow delighted with himself. The world seemed suddenly very clear to him, and very friendly. He found himself glancing sideways at her from time to time. She was looking in the shop windows at the dresses and nightgowns, and at Curl and Hoplin's at the towels and the pots, in the window of the discount barn, and he had stole glances at her hair, the line of her jaw. He observed the way her bare arms came out of the round holes of her blouse. He saw the edge of her slip trap. Of all of these things delighted him. He could not have said why, but what had happened in George Deprog's bedroom had never seemed more distant to him than it did right then. It was time to go, time to meet Ben. But he would sit there just a moment longer while her eyes window shopped, because it was good to look at her, to be with her. 9. Kids were ponying up their quarter admission at the Aladdin's box office window and going into the lobby. Looking through the bank of glass doors, Richie could see a crowd around the candy counter. The popcorn machine was in overdrive, spilling out drifts off the stuff. Its greasy hing lid jittering up and down. He didn't see Ben anywhere. He asked Beverly if she had spotted him. She shook her head. Maybe he already went in. He said he didn't have any money, and the daughter of Frankenstein there would never let him in without a ticket. Richie cocked a thumb at Mrs. Cole, who had been the ticket taker at the Aladdin since a time well before the pictures had begun to talk. Her hair, dyed a bright red, was so thin you could see her scalp beneath. She had Meyerson hanging lips, which she painted with plum-colored lipstick, while blotches of rogue covered her cheeks. Her eyebrows were drawn on its black pencil. Mrs. Cole was a perfect democrat. She hated all kids equally. Boy, I don't want to go in without him. But the show's going to start, Richie said. Where in the heck is he? You can buy him a ticket and leave it in the box office, Bev said, reasonably enough. Then when he comes, Ben came around the corner of Center and Macklin Streets. He was puffing and his belly joggled beneath his sweatshirt. He saw Richie and raised one hand to wave. Then he saw Bev and he stopped in mid-flap. His eyes widened momentarily. He finished his wave and then walked slowly to where they stood under the Aladdin's mannequin. Hi, Richie, he said, and then looked at Bev briefly. It was as if he was afraid that an overlog look might result in a flash burn. Hi, Bev. Hello, Ben, she said, and a strange silence fell between the two of them. It was not precisely awkward. It was Richie, fought almost powerful, and he felt vacuum, a twig of jealousy, because something had passed between them, and whatever it had been, he had been exclusive from it. Howdy, Haystack, he said. Thought you went chicken on me. These movies gone. Scared 10 pounds off your budgie body. Ah, said, say then gone. Turn your hair, white boy. When you come out of this feeder, you gon' need an usher to help you up the aisle. You gon' be shaken so bad. Richie started for the box office, and Ben touched his arm. Ben started to speak, glanced at Bev, who was smiling at him, and had to start over again. I was here, he said, but I went up the street and around the corner where those guys came along. What guys? Richie asked, but he thought he already knew. Henry Bowers, Victor Chris, Belch Huggins, some other guys too. Richie whistled. They must have already gone inside the feeder. I don't see 'em buying candy. Yeah, I guess so. If I was them, I wouldn't bother paying to see them a couple of horror movies, Richie said. I just stay home and look in the mirror, save some bread. Bev laughed merrily at that. But Ben only smiled a little. Henry Bowers had maybe only started out to hurt him that day last week, but he had ended up meaning to kill him. Ben was quite sure of that. Tell you what, Richie said. We'll go up on the balcony. They'll all be sitting down in the second or third row with their feet up. You positive? Ben asked. He was not all sure Richie understood what bad news those kids were. Henry, of course, being the worst of news of all. Richie had barely escaped. That might have been a really bad beating at the hands of Henry and his Spartamos friends 3 months ago. He had managed to include them in a toy department of Freeze's department store. Of all places, understood more about Henry and Mary Crew them than Ben thought he did. If it wasn't fairly positive, I wouldn't go, and he said, I want to see those movies, Haystack, but I don't want to die for him. Besides, if they give us any trouble, we'll just tell Foxy to kick them out, Bev said. Foxy was Mr. Foxworth, the thin, swallow, glum-looking man who managed the Aladdin. He was now selling candy and popcorn, chanting his liturgy of wait your turn, wait your turn, wait your turn. In his threadbare tux and yellow and boiled shirt, he looked like an undertaker who had fallen on hard times. Ben looked doubtfully from Ben to Foxy to Richie. You can't let him run your life, man, Richie said softly. Don't you know that? I guess so, Ben said, and sighed. Actually, he knew no such thing, but Beverly being here and given the equation a crazy skew. If she hadn't come, he would have tried to persuade Richie to go to the movies another day, and if Richie had persuaded, Ben might have bowed out. But Bev was here. He didn't want to talk like a chicken in front of her. And the thought of being with her in the balcony in the dark, even if Richie was between them, as he probably would be, was a powerful attraction. We'll wait until the show starts before we go in, Richie said. He gritted and punched Ben to arm. Shit, Haystack, you want to live forever? Ben's brows drew together, and then he snorted laughter. Richie also laughed, looking at them. Beverly laughed too. Richie approached the ticket booth again. Lips Cole looked at him sourly. Good afternoon, D lady, Richie said in his best baroon butthole voice. I am in Dillon and needs of free tickets to U&D Old American Flicker Tunes. Cut the crap and tell me what you want, kid. Lips barked through the round hole cut in the glass, and something about the way her painted eyebrows were going up and down, unsettling Richie so much that he simply pushed a rumbled dollar through the slot and muttered, Free, please. 3 tickets popped out of the slot. Richie took them. Limps rammed a quarter back at him. Don't be smart. Don't throw popcorn boxes. Don't holler. Don't run in the lobby. Don't run in the aisles. No, ma'am, Richie said, backing away to where Ben and Bev stood. He said to them, It always warms my heart to see an old fart like that who really likes kids. They stood outside a while, waiting for the show to start. Lips glared at them suspiciously from her glass cage. Richie regularly regaled Bev with the story of the dam and the barons, trumpeting Mr. Neal's lines in the new Irish cop voice. Beverly was giggling before long, laughing hard not long after that. Even Ben was grinning a little although his eyes kept shifting either towards the Aladdin's glass doors or to Beverly's face. 10. The balcony was okay. During the first reel of I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, Richie spotted Henry Bowers from his shit-kicking friends. They were down in the second row, just as he had figured they would be. There were 5 or 6 of them, in all 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. All of them with their motor huckle boots cocked up on the seats in the front of them. Foxy would come down and tell them to put their feet on the floor. They would. Foxy would leave. Up went the motor huckle boots again. As soon as he did, 5 or 10 minutes later, Foxy would return, and then the entire charade would be acting out again. Foxy didn't quite have the guts to kick them out, and they knew it. The movies were great. The Teenage Frankenstein was suitably gross. The Teenage Werewolves were somehow scarier. Frew, perhaps because he also seemed a little sad. What had happened wasn't his own fault. There was a hypnotist who had fucked him up, but the only reason he'd be able to was that the kid who turned into the werewolf was full of anger and bad feelings. Richie found himself wondering if there were many people in the world hidden by bad feelings like that. Henry Bowers was just overflowing with bad feelings, but he sure didn't bother hiding them. Beverly sat between the boys, ate popcorn from their boxes, screamed cover her eyes, sometimes laughed when the werewolf was stalking the girl doing exercise in the gym after school. She pressed her face against Ben's arm, and Richie heard Ben's gasp of surprise, even over the screams of the 200 kids below them. The werewolf was finally killed. In the last scene, one cop, Solomon, told another that this should teach people not to fiddle with things, best left to give to God. The curtain came down and the lights came up. There was applause. Richie felt totally satisfied. If a little headache, he'd probably have to go to the eye doctor pretty soon and get his lenses changed again. He really would be wearing Coke bottles on his eyes by the time he got to high school. He fought glumly. Ben twitched at his sleeves. They saw us, Richie, he said in a dry, dismayed voice. Huh? Bowers and Chris. They looked up here on their way out. They saw us. Okay, Richie said. Calm down, Haystack. Just calm down. We'll go out the side door. Nothing to worry about. They went down the stairs. Richie in the lead, Beverly in the middle, Ben bringing up the rear and looking back over his shoulder every 2 steps or so. Have those guys really got it in for you, Ben? Beverly asked. Yeah, I guess they do, Ben said. I got it in a fight with Henry Bowers on the last day of school. Did he beat you up? Not as much as he wanted to, Ben said. That's why he's still mad, I guess. Old Hank the Tank also lost a fair amount of skin, Richie murmured, or so I heard. I don't think he was very pleased about that either. He pushed open the exit door and the 3 of them stepped out into the alley that ran between the Aladdin and Nan's Lebanon. A cat, which had been rooting in the garbage, can hiss and ran past them down the alley, which was blocked at a far end by a board fence. The cat scrambled over and over. Up and over. A trash can lid clattered. Bev jumped, grabbed Richie's arm, and then laughed nervously. I guess I'm still scared from the movie, she said. You won't, Richie began. Hello, fuckface, Henry Bowers said from behind them. Startled, the 3 of them turned around. Henry, Victor, and Belch were standing at the mouth of the alley. There were 2 other guys behind them. Oh, shit, I knew this was going to happen, Ben moaned. Richie turned quickly back toward the Aladdin, but the exit door had closed behind them, and there was no way to open it from the outside. Say goodbye, fuckface, Henry said, and suddenly ran at Ben. The things that happened next seemed to Richie, both of them, and later, like something out of a movie. Such things simply did not happen in real life. In real life, the little kids, their beatings, pick up their teeth and went home. It didn't happen that way this time. Beverly stepped forward and to one side, almost as if she intended to meet Henry. Rap shaked his hand. Richie could hear the cleats on his boot rapping. Victor and Belch were coming after him. The other 2 boys stood at the mouth of the alley, guarding it. "Leave him alone," Beverly shouted. "Become someone your own size." "He's as big as a fucking Mack truck, bitch." Henry, no gentleman, snarled. "Now get out of my—" Richie stuck out his foot. He didn't think he meant it to. His foot went out the same way. Wise cracks, dangerous to his health sometimes, emerge, all on their own, from his mouth. Henry ran to it and fell forward. The brick surface of the alley was slippery with spilled garbage from the overflowing cans of the luggage inside. Henry was skidding like a shuffleboard. Wait. He started to get up, his shirt blotched with coffee grounds, mud, and bits of lettuce. "Oh, you guys are gonna die!" he screamed. Until this moment, Ben had been terrified. Now something in him snapped. He let out a roar and grabbed one of the garbage cans for just a moment, holding it up. Garbage spilling everywhere. He really did look at like haystack hulling them. His face was pale and furious. He threw the garbage can. He struck Henry in the small of the back and knocked him flat again. "Let's get out of here," Richie screamed. They ran toward the mouth of the alley. Victor Chris jumped in front of them. Below, Ben lowered his head and rammed it into Victor's middle. "Woof!" Victor grunted and sat down. Belch grabbed a handful of Beverly's ponytail and whipped her smartly against the Aladdin's brick wall. Beverly bounced off and ran down the alley, rubbing her arm. Richie ran after her, grabbing a garbage lid on the way. Belch Huggins swung a fist almost the size of a daisy ham at him. Richie pissed it out the garbage steel lid. Belch's fist met it. There was a loud bong, a sound that was almost mellow. Richie felt the shot travel all the way up his arm to shoulder. Belch screamed and began to hop up and down, holding his swelling hand. "Yonder lies the tent of the Faden," Richie said confidently, doing a very possible Tony Curtis voice, and then ran after Ben and Beverly. One of the boys at the mouth of the alley had caught Beverly. Ben was tussling with him. The other boy began to rabbit punch Ben in the small of the back. Richie swung his foot. It connected with the rabbit puncher's buttocks. The boy howled with pain. Richie grabbed Beverly's arm in one hand, Ben's in the other. "Run!" he shouted. The boy, Ben, had been tussling with let go of Beverly and looped a punch at Richie. His ears exploded with memorable pain, then went numb and became very warm. A high whistling sound began to wind in his head. It sounded like the noise you were supposed to listen for when the school nurse put the earphones on you to test your hearing. They ran down Center Street. People turned to look at them. Ben's large stomach poged up and down. Beverly's ponytail bounced. Richie let go of Ben and held his glasses against his forehead with his left thumb so he wouldn't lose them. His head was still ringing and he believed his ears was going to swell, but he felt wonderful. He started laughing. Beverly joined him. Soon Ben was laughing too. They cut up Court Street and collapsed on the bench in front of the police station. At that moment, it seemed the only place in Derry where they might possibly be safe. Beverly looped an arm around Ben's neck and Richie's. She gave them a furious hug. "That was great," her eyes sparkled. "Did you see those guys? Did you see them?" "I saw them all right," Ben gasped, "and I never want to see them again." This sent off into another storm of hypocritical laughter. Richie kept expecting Henry's gang to come around the corner onto the Court Street and take after them again. Police station or not, still, he could not stop laughing. Beverly was right. It had been great. "The Losers Club gets off a good one," Richie yelled extremously. "Wacka, wacka, wacka." He cupped his hands around his mouth and put on his Ben Byrne voice. "Yowza, yowza, yowza children's." A cop poked his head out of an open second-floor window and shouted, "You kids gotta get out of here, right now. Take a walk." Richie opened his mouth to say something brilliant, quiet possibly in his brand-new Irish cop voice, and Ben kicked his foot. "Shut up, Richie," he said, and promptly had trouble believing that he had such a thing. "Right, Richie," Bev said, looking at him fondly. "Beep, beep. Okay, Richie?" "Okay," Richie said. "What do you guys want to know? Want to go find Henry Bowers and ask him if he wants to work it out over a game of Monopoly?" Bite your tongue, Bev said. Huh? What does that mean? Never mind, Bev said. Some guys are so arrogant. Pensively blushing furiously, Ben asked, Did that guy hurt your hair, Beverly? She smiled at him, genuinely, and in the moment she became sure of something she had only guessed at before, that it had been Ben Hanscom who had sent her the postcard with the beautiful little haiku on it. No, it wasn't bad, she said. Let's go down in the Barrens, Richie proposed. And so that was there where they went, or where they escaped, Richie would think later. That it would see it set apart there for the rest of the summer. The Barrens had become their place. Beverly, like Ben on the day of his first encounter with the big boys, had never been down there before. She walked between Richie and Ben as the three of them moved single file down the path. Her skirt twitched prettily, and looking at her, Ben was aware of waves of feeling as powerful as stomach cramps. She was wearing her ankle bracelet. It flashed in the afternoon sun. They crossed the arms of the Canstick. The boys had dammed up. The stream divided about 70 yards farther up along its course, and become one again, about 200 yards farther on Toratown, using stepping stones downstream of the place where the dam had been found another path, and eventually came out of on the bank of the stream's eastern fork, which was much wider than the other. It sparkled in the afternoon light to his left. Ben could see two of those concertina cylinders with the manhole covers on top. Below them, jutting out over the stream, were large conversant pipes. Thin streams of muddy water poured over the lips of these outflow pipes and into the Cansick. Someone takes a crap uptown, and here's where it comes out. Ben thought, remembering Mr. Nell's explanation of Derrinch's systems. He felt a dull sort of helpless anger. Once there had probably been fish in this river. Now your chances of catching a throat wouldn't be so hot. Your chances of catching a used wad of toilet paper would be better. It's so beautiful here, Bev sighed. Yeah, not bad, Richie agreed. The black flies are gone, and there's enough of the breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. He looked at her hopefully. Got any cigarettes? No, she said. I had a couple, but I smoked them yesterday. Too bad, Richie said. There was the blast of an air horn, and they all watched as a long freight rumbled across the embankment on the far side of the Barrens and toward the train yards. Geez, if it was passenger train, they had a great view, Richie thought. First the poor folks' houses of the old Cape, then the bamboo swamps on the other sides of the Cansick, and finally, before leaving the Barrens, the smoldering gravel pit that was the town dump. For just a moment, he found himself thinking about Eddie's story again. The leper under the abandoned house on Neobolt Street. He pushed it out on his mind and turned to Ben. So, what was your best part? Haystack, huh? Ben turned him guiltily. As Bev looked out across the Cansick, lost in thoughts of her own, he had been looking at her profile and at the bruise of her cheekbone. Of the movies, Dumbo. What was your best part? I liked it when Dr. Frankenstein started tossing the bodies to the crocodile under his house. Ben said, that was my best part. That was gross, Beverly said and shivered. I hate things like that. Crocodiles and piranhas and sharks. Yeah, what's piranhas? Richie asked, immediately interested. Little tiny fish, Beverly said, and they've got all those little tiny teeth, but they're wicked sharp, and if you go into the river where they are, they eat you right down to the bone. Wow, I saw this once in these natives wanted to cross a river, but the footbridge was down, she said, so they put a cow in the water on the rope and crossed while the piranhas were eating the cow. When they pulled it out, the cow was nothing but a skeleton. I had nightmares for a week. Man, I wish I had some of those fish, Richie said happily. I put him in Henry Bauer's bathtub. Ben began to giggle. I don't think he takes baths. I don't know about that, but I do know we better watch out for those guys, Beverly said. Her fingers touched the bruises on her cheek. My dad went up the side of my head day before yesterday, before breaking a pile of dishes. One a week is enough. There was a moment of silence that might have been awkward, but was not. Richie broke it by saying his best part was when the teenage werewolf got the evil hypnotized. They talk about the movies and other horror movies they had seen, and Alfred Hitchcock presents on TV for an hour for more. Bev spotted daisies growing on the river bank and picked one. She held it first under Richie's chin and then under Ben's chin to see if they like butter. She said they both did as she held the flower under their chins. Each was conscious of her light touch on their shoulders, and then the clean sense of her hair. Her face was close to Ben's only for a moment or two. But that night he dreamed of how her eyes and look during the brief endless span of time. Conversation was fading a little when they heard the crackling sounds of people approaching along the path. The three of them turned quickly towards the sound, and Richie was suddenly currently aware that the river was at their backs. There was no place to run. The voices drew closer. They got to their feet, Richie and Ben moving a little in front, Beverly without even thinking about it. The screen of bushes at the end of the path shook, and suddenly Bill Deprog emerged. Another kid was with him, a fellow Richie knew a little bit. His name was Bradley, he had terrible lips. Probably went up to Bagger with Bill for that speech therapy thing, Richie thought. Big Bill, he said, and then in the voice of Toodles, "We are glad to see you, Mr. Deprog, Master." Bill looked at them and grinned in a particular stern and stole over Richie as Bill looked from him to Ben to Beverly, and then back to Bradley, whatever his name was. Beverly was a part of them. Bill's eyes said so. Bradley, what's his name, was not. He might stay for a while today, might even come down to the Barriers again. No one would tell him no. So sorry, the Losers Club membership is full. We already have our speech invented member, but he was not part of it. He was not part of them. This thought led to sudden international fear. For a moment, he felt the way you did when you suddenly realized you had swum out too far in the water was over your head. There was an innovative flash. We're being drawn into something. Being picked and chosen. None of this is accidental. Are we well here yet? Then the admission fell into the meaningless jumble of thought, like the smash of a glass pan on the stone floor. Besides, it didn't matter. Bill was here, and Bill would take care. Bill would not let things get out of control. He was the tallest of them, and surely the most handsome. Richie only had to look sideways at Bev's eyes, fixed on Bill, and then farther to Ben's eyes, fixed noticeably and unhappily on Bev's face, to know that Bill was also the strongest of them, and not just physically. There was a good deal more to do it than that. But since Richie did not know either the word Christmas or the full of meaning of the word magnificence, he only felt that Bill's strength ran deep in mind, magnificently itself, in many ways, some of them probably unexpected, and Richie suspected if Beverly fell for him, or got a crush on him, or whatever they call it, Belle would not be jealous like he would. Richie thought, if she got a crush on me, he would accept it as nothing but natural, and there was something else. Bill was good. It was stupid to think such a thing. He did not, in fact, precisely think it felt it. But there it was. Goodness and strength seemed to radiate from Bill. He was like a knight in an old movie, a movie that was corny but still had the power to make you cry and cheer and clap at the end. Strong and good, and 5 years later, at his memory of what happened in Derry, both during and before that summer, had begun to fade rapidly. It occurred to a Richie Torzor in his mid-teens that John Kinney reminded him of stuttering Bill. Who, his mind would responded? He would look up, thankfully puzzled, and shake his head. Some guy I used to know. He would think and would dismiss vagus unease by pushing his glasses up on his nose and turn into his homework. Again, some guy I used to know a long time ago. Bill Deprog put his hand on his hips, smiled suddenly, and said, well, here we are. Now, what are you doing here? Got any cigarettes? Richie asked hopefully. 11. 5 days later, as June drew towards its reed, Bill told Richie that he wanted to go down to Neobolt Street and investigate it under the porch, where Richie had been seen the leper. They had just arrived back at Richie's house, and Bill was walking Silver. He had ridden Richie double most of the way home, an exhilarating speed trip across Derry, but he had been carefully to let Richie dismount a block away from his house. If Richie Mutters saw Bill riding Richie double, she have a bird. Silver's wire basket was full of play 6 scooters. 2 of them, Bill's, 3 of them, Richie's. They had been down in the barrens for most of the afternoon playing guns. Beverly Marsh had shown up around 3 o'clock, wearing faded jeans, and toted a very old Daisy air rifle that had lost most of its pops. When you pulled its tape-wrapped trigger, it uttered a wheeze that sounded to Richie more like someone sitting on a very old whoopee cushion than a rifle shot. Her spectacle was Japanese sniper. She was very good at climbing trees and shooting the unaware as they passed below. The bruise on her cheekbone had faded to a faint yellow. "What did you say?" Richie asked. He was shocked, but also a little interrogated. I want to look that porch," Bill said. His voice was stubborn, but he wouldn't look at Richie. There was a hard spot of flush high on each of his cheekbones. They arrived in the front of Richie's house. Maggie Torzor was on the porch reading a book. She waved to them and called, "Hi, boys. Want some iced tea?" "We'll be right there, Mom," Richie said, and then to Bill, "There isn't going to be anything there. He probably just saw a hobo and got all bent out of shape. For God's sake, you know Eddie." "Yeah, I know Eddie, but remember the picture in the album?" Richie shifted his fingers uncomfortably. Bill raised his right hand. The Band-Aids were gone now, but Richie could see circlings of healing scab on Bill's first 3 fingers. "Yeah, but listen to me," Bill said. He began to speak very slowly, holding Richie's eyes with his own. Once more he related similarity between Ben's story and Eddie's, and tied those to what they had seen in the picture that moved. He suggested again that the clown had murdered the boys and girls who had been found dead in Derry since the previous December. "And maybe not just them," Bill finished. "What about all the ones who disappeared? What about Eddie Corden?" "Shit, his stepfather scared them off," Richie said. "Well, maybe he did, and maybe he didn't," Bill said. "I knew him a little bit, too. And I know who his dad beat him, and I also know he used to stay out nights, sometimes to get away from him. So maybe the clown got him while he was staying away," Richie said thoughtfully. "Is that it?" Bill nodded. "What do you want, then? Its autograph?" "If the clown killed the others, then he killed Georgie," Bill said. His eyes caught Richie's. They were like slant, hard, uncompressing, unforgiving. "I want to kill it." "Jesus Christ," Richie said, frightening. "How are you going to do that?" My dad got a pistol," Bill said. A little spittle flew from his lips, but Richie barely noticed. "He doesn't know. I know, but I do. It's on the top shelf of the closet." "That's great if it's a man," Richie said. "And if we can find him sitting on the pile of kids' bones." "I poured the tea, boys," Richie's mom called cheerfully. "Better come and get it." "Right there, Mom," Richie called again, offering a big false smile. It disappeared immediately as he turned back to Bill. "Because I wouldn't shoot a guy just because he was wearing a clown suit, Billy. You're my best friend, but I wouldn't do it, and I wouldn't let you do it if I could stop you." "What if there really was a pile of bones?" Richie licked his lips and said nothing for a moment. Then he asked Bill, "What are you going to do if it's not a man, Billy?" What if it really is some kind of monster? What if there really are such things? Ben Haskins said it was the mummy, and the balloons were floating against the wind, and it didn't cast a shadow. The picture in the Georgie's album, either we imagine that or it was magic. And I gotta tell you, man, I don't think we just imagine it. Your fingers sure didn't imagine it, did they? Bill shook his head. So what are we going to do if it's not a man, Billy? Then we'll have to figure out something else out. Oh yeah, Richie said. I can see it. After you shoot it 4 or 5 times and it keeps coming at like a teenage werewolf in that movie me and Ben and Bev saw, you can try your bullseye on it. And if the bullseye doesn't work, I'll throw some of my sneezing powder at it. And if it keeps on coming after that, we'll just call time and say, hey now, hold on. This ain't getting it, Mr. Monster. Look, and I got to read up at the library. I'll be back. Pardon me. Is that what you're going to say, Big Bill? He looked at his friends, his head fudding rapidly. Part of him wanted Bill to press on with his idea to check under the porch of that old house. But other part desperately wanted to Bill to give the idea. In some way, all of this was like having stepped into one of those Saturday afternoon horror movies at the Aladdin, but in other way, in Kirkley way. It wasn't like that at all, because this wasn't safe like a movie, where you knew everything would turn out all right, and even if it didn't, it was no skin off your ass. The picture in Georgie's room hadn't been like a movie. He he was forgetting that, but apparently had been fooling himself, because now he could see those cuts whirling up Billy's finger. If he hadn't pulled Bill back, incredibly, Bill was grinning. Actually grinning. You want me to take you look at the picture, he said. Now I want to take to look at a house for the tat. You got no tits, Richie said, and they both burst out laughing. Tomorrow morning, Bill said, as if I had been resolved. And if it's a monster, Richie asked, holding Bill's eyes, if your dad's gun doesn't stop it. Big Bill, if it just keeps coming, well, think of something else, Bill said again. We'll have to. He threw back his head and laughed like a loon. After a moment, Richie joined him. It was impossible not to. They walked to the crazy pavement to Richie's porch again. Margaret had set out huge glasses of iced tea with mint springs in them and a plate of vanilla wafers. You want to? Well, no, Richie said, but I will. Bill clapped him on the back hard, and that seemed to make the fear bearable, although Richie was suddenly sure, and he was not wrong, that sleep would be long coming that night. You boys look like you were having a serious discussion out there, Mrs. Torzor said, sitting down with her book in one hand and a glass of iced tea in the mutter. She looked at the boys acceptably. Debrog's got this crazy idea. The Red Sox are going to finish in first. Richie said, me and Dad think they've got a shot at third, Bill said, and sip his iced tea. This is very good, Mrs. Tozier. Thank you, Bill. The year the Sox finish in first will be the year you stop stuttering, mushmouth, Richie said. Richie! Mrs. Torzor screamed, shocked. She nearly dropped her glass of iced tea. But both Richie and Bill Debrog were laughing hysterically, totally cracked up. She looked from her son to Bill and back to her son again, touched by wonder that was most simply, predictably, but partly a fear so thin and sharp that it found its way deep into her inner heart and vibrated there like a tunning fork made of clear ice. I don't understand either of them, she thought. Where they go, what they do, what they want, or what will become of them. Sometimes their eyes are wild, and sometimes I'm afraid for them, and sometimes I'm afraid of them. She found herself thinking, not for the first time, that it would have been nice if she and Went could have had a girl as well, with pretty blonde hair, that she could have dressed in skirts and matching bows and black patent leathers shoes on Sundays, a pretty little girl who would ask to bake cupcakes after school and who wants dolls instead of books on ventriloquists and Revol models of cars that went fast. A pretty little girl she could have understood. 12. Did you get it? Richie asked obnoxiously. They were walking their bikes up Kansan Street beside the Barrens at 10 o'clock the next morning. The sky was a dull gray. Rain had been forecast of that afternoon. Richie hadn't gotten to sleep until after midnight, and he thought Deprog looked as if he had spent a fairly restless night himself. Old Big Bill was taught in a match set of Solomon bags, one under each eye. I got it, Bill said. He patted the green duffel coat he was wearing. Let me see, Richie said, fascinated. Not now, Bill said, and then grinned. Someone else might see, too. But I looked what else I brought. He reached behind him, under the coat, and brought his bullseye slingshot out of his back pocket. Oh, shit, we're in trouble, Richie said, beginning to laugh. Bill pretended to be hurt. It was your idea, Tozier. Bill had gotten the custom alum slingshot for his birthday the year. It had been Zach's compliments between the .22. Bill had wanted it, and his mother admitted a refusal to even concern given a boy Bill's age a firearm. The instruction booklet said a slingshot could be a fine hunting weapon once you learn to use it. In the right hands, your bullseye slingshot is as deadly and effective as a good ash bow or a high-powered firearm. The booklet proclaimed with such verdurous dolefully extolled. The booklet went on to warn that a slingshot could be dangerous. The owner should no more aim one of the 20 ball bearing slugs which came with at a person that he would aim a loaded pistol at a person. Bill wasn't very good at it yet, and guessed privately he probably never would be. But he thought the booklet's caution was merited. The slingshot, thick, elastic, had a hard pull, and when you hit a tin can with it, it made one hell of a hole. You doing any better with it, Big Bill? Richie asked. A little, Bill said. This was only partly true after much study of the pictures in the booklet, which were labeled figs, as in Fig 1, Fig 2, and so on. Enough practice in Dairy Park to lame his arm he had gotten so he could hit the paper target, which had also come with a slingshot, maybe 3 times out of every 10 tires. And once he had gotten a bullseye, almost Richie pulled the slingshot back by the cup, twanged it, then handed it back. He said nothing, but privately doubted if it would count for as much as Zach Deprog's pistol when it came to killing most monsters. Yeah, he said, you brought your slingshot, okay? Big deal. That's nothing. Look what I brought, Deprog. And from his own jacket, he hauled out of a pocket with a cartoon picture on it of a bald man saying, Achoo! At his cheek, puffed out like dizzy Jepalog's Dr. Whacker's sneezing powder. The packet said, it's a laugh rot. The two of them stared at each other for a long moment and then broke up, screaming with laughter, and pounded each other on the back. We're prepared for anything, Bill said, finally, still giggling and wiping his eye with a sleeve out of his jacket. Your face in my ass, stuttering Bill, Richie said. I thought it was the other way around, Bill said. Now listen, we're gonna stash your bike down in the Barrens, where I put the silver. When we play, you ride double behind me in case we have to make it quick getaway. Richie nodded, feeling no urge to agree. His 22-inch reed ledge, he sometimes whammed his kneecaps on his handlebars when he was paddling fast, looked like a pandemic bike next to the Scramaway Genter, like identified that was Silver. He knew that Bill was stronger and then Silver was faster. They got to the little bridge, and Bill helped Richie stow his bike underneath. They sat down, and with the occasional rumble of traffic passing over their head, Bill unzipped his duffels and took out his father's pistol. You be goddamn careful, Bill said, handed it over after Richie had whistled his frank approval. There's no safety on the pistol like that. It is loaded, Richie asked, awed the pistol, a PBK Walther, that Zach Deprock picked up during the occasion. It seemed unbelievably heavy. No, not yet, Bill said. He patted his pocket. I got some bullets in here. But my dad says sometimes you look and then if the gun you thinks you're not being careful, it's loaded itself, so it can shoot you. His face uttered strange smile, which said that while he didn't believe anything so silly, he believed it completely. Richie understood there was a caged deadliness in the thing that he had never sensed in his dad. 22, 30, minus 30, or even the shotgun, although there was something about the shotgun. Wasn't there something about the way it leaned, mute and oily, in the corner of the garage closet, as if it might say, I could be mean if I wanted to, plenty mean if it could speak. But this pistol, this Walther, it was as if it had been made for the express purpose of shooting people. With a chill, Richie realized that was why it had been made. What else could you do with a pistol? Use it to light your cigarettes? He turned the muzzle toward him, being careful to keep his hands far away from the trigger. One look into the Walther's black-lidded eye made him understand Bill's particular smile perfectly. He remembered his father saying, "If you remember, there is no such thing as a unloaded gun. You'll be okay with firearms with your life, all your life." Richie, he handed the gun back to Bill, glad to be rid of it. Bill stowed it in his duffel coat again. Suddenly, the house on Neobolt Street seemed less frightening to Richie, but the possibility that blood might actually be spilled, that seemed much stronger. He looked at Bill, perhaps meaning to appeal this idea again. But he saw Bill's face, reading it, and only said, "You ready?" 13. As always, when Bill finally pulled his second foot up from the ground, Richie felt sure that they would crash, splitting their silly skulls on unyielding cement. The big bike wavered crazily from side to side. The car's clothespin to the fender struts stopped, firing single shots, and started machine gunning. The bike's drunken warnerverse became more pronounced. Richie closed his eyes and waited for the invisible. Then, Bill below. "Hi-yo, Silver! Away!" The bike picked up more speed and finally stopped that seasick, side to side, wavering. Richie loosened his deft grip on Bill's middle and held the front of the package carrier over the rear wheel instead. Bill crossed Kansas Street on the slant, raced down side streets at an ever-quickened pace, heading for Witcham, as if racing down a seat off genealogical steps. They came bulletin out of Stampham Street and onto Witcham at an extraordinary rate of speed. Bill laid Silver down near over on his side and below. "Hi-yo, Silver!" Again, riding it. "Big Bill!" Richie screamed, so scared he was nearly creaming his jeans, but laughing wildly all the same. "Stand on this baby!" Bill suited the action to the world, getting up and leaning over the handlebars and pumping the pebbles at a lunatic rate, looking at Bill's back, which was amazingly broad for a boy of 11, going on 12, watching it work. Under the duffel coat, the shoulders slanted first one way and then the another, as he shifted his weight from one pedal to the other. Richie suddenly became sure that they were invulnerable. They would live forever and ever. Well, perhaps. Not they, but Bill. Bill had no idea how strong he was, how somehow sure and perfect. They sped along the houses, thinning out of a little now, the streets crossing Richmond at longer intervals. "Hi-yo, Silver!" Bill yelled, and Richie hollered in his nigger Jim voice, high and shrill. "Hi-yo, Silver, massa that's ret. You been rapping and dismount bike for show. Locks and mussy. Hi-yo, Silver, away!" They were passing green fields that looked flat and depthless under the gray sky. Richie could see the old brick train station up ahead in the distance. To the right of the croissant warehouses marched off in a row. Silver bumped over one set of train tracks, then another. And there was Neobolt Street, cutting off to the right. Dairy train yards, a blue sign under the street. Sign, read. It was rusty and hung askew. Below this was a much bigger sign. Yellow field, black letters. It was almost like a comment on the train yards themselves. Dead end, it read. Bill turned onto Neobolt Street, coasted to the sidewalk, and put his foot back down. Let's walk from here. Richie slipped off the package carrier with mingling feelings off, relief and regret. Okay, they walk along the sidewalk, which was cracked and weeded. Up ahead of them, in the train yards, a diesel engine revved slowly up, faded off, and then began all over again. Once or twice they heard the maniacal music of couplings being smashed together. You scared, Richie? Asked Bill. Bill, walking Silver by the handlebars, looked over at Richie briefly and then nodded. Yeah, you? I sure am, Richie said. Bill told Richie he had asked his father about Neobolt Street the night before. His father said that a lot of trainmen had lived out this way until the end of World War II. Engineers, conductors, single men, yard workers, badge and handlers. The street had declined with the train yards, and as Bill and Richie moved farther along it, the houses became farther apart, seemed a little dirtier. The last 3 or 4 on both sides were empty and boarded up. Their yards overgrown. On both sides were empty and boarded up. Their yards overgrown. A for sale sign flapped formally from the porch of one. To Richie, the sign looked about 1,000 years old. The sidewalk stopped, and now they were walking along a beaten track from which weeds grew half-heartedly. Bill stopped and pointed. There it is, he said softly. 29 Neobolt Street. Had once been a trim red Cape Cod. Maybe Richie thought. An engineer used to live here, a balconier with no pants but jeans, and lots of those gloves with the big stiff cuffs and 4 or 5 pillow stacks caps. A fellow who would come home once or twice a month for stretches of 3 days or 4 days and listen to the radio while he pottered in the garden. A fellow who would eat mostly fried food and no vegetables, although he would grow them for his friends, and who would, on windy nights, think about the girl he left behind. Now the red paint had faded to a wishy-washy pink that was peeling away, in ugly patches that looked like snores. The windows were blind eyes, boarded up. Most of the shingles were gone. Weeds grew rankily down both sides of the house, and the lawn was covered with the season's first bumper crop of dandelions to the left, a high board fence, perhaps once a neat white but now faded to a dull gray that almost matched the lowering sky, lurched drunkenly in and out of the dank shrubbery. About halfway down this fence, Richie could see in a monstrous grove of sunflowers, the tallest looked 5 feet tall or more. They had a botulid, nasty look he didn't like. A breeze rustled then, and they seemed to nod together. The boys are here. Isn't that nice? More boys. Our boys, Richie shivered, while Bill leaned Silver carefully against an elm. Richie surveyed the house. He saw a wheel sticking out of the thick grass near the porch and pointed it out to Bill. Bill nodded. It was overturned strike Eddie had mentioned. They looked up and down Neobolt Street. The chug of the diesel engine rose and fell off. They began again. To sound seemed to hang in the overcast like a charm. The street was utterly deserted. Richie could hear occasionally cars passing on Route 2, but could not see them. The diesel engine chugged and faded. The huge sunflowers nodded sagely together. Fresh boys, good boys, our boys. You ready? Bill asked, and Richie jumped a little. You know, I was just thinking that maybe the last bunch of Berry books I took out are due today, Richie said. Maybe I ought to cut the crap, Richie. Are you ready or not? I guess I am, Richie said, knowing he was not ready at all. He was never going to be ready for this scene. They crossed the overgrown lawn to the porch. Look there, Bill said. At the far left-hand side, the porch's lattice work skirt leaned out against a triangle of bushes. Both boys could see the rusty nails that had been pulled free. There were cold rose bushes here, and a while the roses both to the right and the left of the unaccord stretch of lattice work were blooming in a lace tactical way. Those directly around and in front of it were skeletal and dead. Bill and Richie looked at each other grimly. Everything Eddie said seemed true enough. 7 weeks later, the evidence was still here. You don't really want to go under there, do you? Richie asked. He was almost pleading. No, Bill said, but I'm going. And with a sinking heart, Richie saw that he absolutely meant it. That gray light was back in Billy's eyes, shining steadily. There was a stony engineers in the lines of his face that made him look older. Richie thought, I think he really does mean to kill it. If it's still there, kill it and maybe cut off its head and take it to his father and say, look, this is what killed Georgie. Now will you talk to me again at night? Maybe just tell me how your day was or who lost when you guys were flipping to see who paid for the morning coffee. Bill, he said, but Bill was no longer there. He was walking around to the right end of the porch, where Eddie must have crawled under. Richie had to chase after him, and he almost fell over the trike, caught in the weeds and slowly rusting its way onto the ground. He caught up as Bill squatted, looking under the porch. There was no skirt at all on this end. Some hobo, had pried it off long ago to gain across the shelter underneath, out of the January snow, or the cold November rain, or a summer thunder shower. Richie squatted beside him, his heart thumping like a drum. There was nothing under the porch but drifts of moldery leaves, yellowing newspaper, and shadows. Too many shadows. Bill, he repeated. Well, what? Bill had produced his father Walters again. He pulled the clip carefully from the grip and then took 4 bullets from his pants pocket. He loaded them in the one at a time. Richie watches this, fascinated, and then looked under the porch again. He saw something else this time. Broken glass, faintly glinted shards of glass. His stomach cramped painfully. He was not a stupid boy, and he understood this came close to completely confirming Eddie's story. Splinterings of glass on the moldering leaves under the porch meant that the window had been broken from inside, from the cellar. What? Bill asked again, looking up at Richie. His face was grim and white. Looking at that set face, Richie mentally threw in the towel. Nothing, he said. You coming? Yeah. They crawled under the porch. The smell of decay and leaves was a smell Richie usually liked, but there was nothing pleasant about the smell under here. The leaves felt spongy under his hand and knees, and he had an impression that they might go down for 2 or 3 feet. He suddenly wondered what he would do if a hand or a claw sprang out of those leaves and seized him. Bill was examining the broken window. Glass had sprayed everywhere. The wooden strip, which had been between the panes, lay in 2 splintering pieces under the porch steps. The top of the window frame jutted out like a broken bone. Something hit that fucker wicked hard, Richie breathed. Bill, now peering inside her, trying to nod it. Richie, below him, aside, enough so he could look too. The basement was a dim ladder of crates and boxes. The floor was earth, and like the leaves, it gave off a damp and humid armor, a furious bulk to the left, thrusting round pipes at the low ceiling beyond it. At the end of the cellar, Richie could see a large stall with wooden sides, a horse stall. What was his first thought? But who kept horses in Jeasley's cellar? Then he realized that in a house as old as this one, the furnace must have burned coal instead of oil. Nobody had bothered to convert the furnace because no one wanted the house. That thing with the sides was the coal bin. To the far right, Richie could make out a flight of stairs going up to the ground level. Now Bill was sitting down, hunching himself forward, and before Richie could actually believe what he was up to, his friend's legs were disappearing into the window. Bill, Christ's sake, he hissed. What are you doing? Get out of here. Bill didn't reply. He slithered through, scraping his duffel coat up from the small of his back, barely missing a chunk of glass that would have cut him in a good way. A second later, Richie heard his tennises smack down on the hard earth inside. Piss on this action, Richie muttered faintly to himself, looking at the square of darkness into which his friend had disappeared. Bill, you gone out of your mind? Bill's voice floated up. You can stay up there if you want, Richie. Stand guard. Instead, he rolled over on his belly and shoved his legs through the cellar window before his nerves could go bad on him, hoping he couldn't cut his hand or his stomach on the broken glass. Something clutched his legs. Richie screamed. It's just me, Bill hissed, and a moment later, Richie was standing beside in the cellar, pulling down his shirt and his jacket. Who did you think it was? The boogeyman? Richie said and laughed shakily. You got that way. Fuck that, Richie said. He could actually hear this heartbeat in his voice, making it sound bumpy and uneven, first up and then down. I'm sticking with you, Big Bill. They moved toward the Coppolan first. Bill strided slightly in the lead, the gun in his hand. Richie closed behind him, trying to look everywhere at once. Bill stood beyond one of the culprits, jutting wood sides for a moment, and then suddenly darted around it, pointing the gun with both hands, and then suddenly darted around it, pointing the gun with both hands. Richie squinched his eyes shut, steeling himself for the explosion. It didn't come. He opened his eyes again, courteously. Nothing but coal, Bill said, and giggled nervously. Richie stepped up beside Bill and looked. There was still a drift old coal in here, piled up almost to the ceiling at the back of the stall and trickling away to the lump or two by their feet. It was black as Crow's wig. Let's, Richie began, and then the door out of the head of the cellar stairs crashed open against the wall with a violent bang, spilling thin, white daylight down the stairs. Both boys screamed. Richie heard snarling sounds. They were very loud, the sounds of wild animals in a cage might make. He saw loafers descend the steps, faded jeans on the top of them, swinging hands. But they weren't hands, they were paws, huge misshapen paws. Climb the coal, Bill was screaming, but Richie stood frozen, suddenly knowing that was coming for them. That what was going to kill them in the cellar that stank up damp earth and the cheap wine that had been spilled in the corners, knowing but needing the coal to see. There's a window at the top of the coal. The paws were covered with dense brown hair that curled up and coiled like wire. The fingers were tipped with jagged nails. Now Richie saw a slick jacket. It was black with orange piping, the Derry High School colors. Go! Bill screamed and gave Richie a gigantic shove. Richie went sprawling into the coal. Sharp jags in the corners of it poked him, painfully breaking through his daze. More coal advanced over his hands. That mad swirling went on and on. Panic slipped its hood over Richie's mind. Barely aware of what he was doing, he scrambled the mountain of coal, gaining ground, sliding back, lunging upward again, screaming as he went. The window at the top was grim black with coal dust and lit, the next of no light at all. It was latched shut. Richie seized the latch, which was of the sort that turned, and threw it all his weight against it. The latch moved not at all. The snarling was closer now. The gun went off below him, the sound nearly deafening the closed room. Gun smoke, sharp and astringent, strung Richie's nose. It shocked him back to some sort of awareness, and he realized that he had been trying to turn the thumb latch the wrong way. He reversed the direction of the force he was applying, and the latch gave with a protracted, rusty sequel. Cold dust shifted down on his hands like pepper. The gun went off again with a second defiant bang. Bill Deppard shouted, "You killed my brother, you fucker!" For a moment, the creature which had come down the stairs seemed to laugh, seemed to speak. It was as if Vigis' dog had suddenly begun to bark out garbled words, and for a moment, Richie thought the thing in the high school jacket snarled back, "I'm going to kill you too!" Richie Bill screamed then, and Richie heard coal clattering and falling again as Bill scrambled up. The snarls and roars continued, wood splintering. There were mingled barks and howls, sounds out of a cold nightmare. Richie gave the window and tremor a shove, not caring if the glass broke and cut his hands to ribbons. He was beyond carrying it did not break. It swung outward on an old steel hinge, flaked with rust. More coal dust shifted down this time on Richie's face. He wiggled out into the side yard like an eel, smelled sweet fish, air, feeling the long grass whipped at his face. He was dimly aware that it was raining. He could see the thick stalks of the giant sunflower, green and hairy. The wolfer went off of a third time, and the beast in the cellar screamed a prurient sound of pure rage. Then Bill cried, "I got me, Richie! Help, it's got me!" Richie turned around on his hand and knees and saw the terrified circle of his friend's upturned face in the square of the oversized cellar window through which a winter's load of coal had once been thrown each October. Bill was lying spiritlessly on the coal. His hands waved and clutched furiously for a window frame, which was out of reach. His shirt and jacket was rucked up almost to his breastbone, and he was sliding backward. No, he was being pulled backward by something Richie could barely see. It was a moving, bulking shadow behind Bill, a shadow that snarled and gibbered and sounded almost human. Richie didn't need to see it. He had seen it was previous Saturday on the screen of the Aladdin Theater. It was mad, totally mad. But even so, it ever occurred to Richie to doubt either his own sanity or his conclusion. The teenage werewolf had Bill Deprog, only it wasn't that guy Michael Landlin with a lot of makeup on his face. It was with a lot of fake fur. It was real. As if to prove it, Bill screamed again. Richie reached in and caught Bill's hand in his own. The Wolfer pistol was one of them. And for the second time that day, Richie looked up into its black eyes. Only this time it was loaded. They tussled Bill. Richie gripped in his hand, the werewolf gripping his ankle. "Get out of here, Richie!" Bill screamed. "Get!" The face of the werewolf suddenly swam of the darkness. Its forehead was low and purposelessly covered with scant hair. Its cheeks were hollow and in fury. Its eyes were a dark brown filled with horror and intelligence. Horrible awareness. Its mouth dropped open, and it began to snarl. White foam ran from the corners of its thick lower lip, began to snarl. White foam ran from the corners of its thick lower lips in twin streams that dripped from its chin. The hair on its head was swept back in a gruesome parody of a teenager's DA. It threw its head back and roared, its eyes never leaving Richie's. Bill scrambled up the coal. Richie seized his forearms and pulled. For a moment, he thought he was actually going to win. Then the werewolf laid hold of Bill's legs again, and he was yanked backward towards the darkness. Once more, it was stronger. It had laid hold of Bill, and it meant to have then no thought at all about what he was doing or why he was doing it. Richie heard the voice of the Irish cop coming out of his mouth. Mr. Nell's voice. But this was not Richie Tozer doing a bad impersonation. It wasn't even persistless. Mr. Nell, it was the voice of every Irish cop, beat cop, that had ever lived in Twirl-a-Billy by its rawhide rope as he tried the doors of closed shops after midnight. "Let go of him, boyo, or I'll crack your thick head, I swear to Jesus. Let go of him now, and I'll serve you an arson of plater." The creature in the cellar let out of an ear-splitting roar of rage, but it seemed to Richie that there was another note in the below as well, perhaps fear or pain. He gave one more tremulous tug, and Bill flew out of the window and onto the grass. He stared up at Richie with dark, horrified eyes. The front of his jacket was smeared black with coal dust. "Quick!" Bill panted. He was nearly moaning. He grabbed at Richie's shirt. "We got to..." Richie could hear coal trembling and Evangeline down again. A moment later, the werewolf's face filled the cellar window. It snarled at them. It paws clutched at the listed grass. Bill still had the wool turret. He had held onto the gun through all of it. Now he held it out with both hands. His eyes squinched down to slits and pulled the trigger. There was another defending bang. Richie saw a chunk of the werewolf's skull tear free, and a torrent of blood spilled down the side of its face, matter in the fur, there in a soak in the collar of the school jacket it wore. Roaring, it began to climb out of the window, moving slowly. Dreamily, Richie reached under his coat and into his back pocket. He brought out the envelope with the picture of the sneezing man on it. He tore it open as the bleeding, roaring creature pulled itself out of the window, forcing its way, claws digging deep furrows in the earth. Richie tore the packet open and squeezed it. "Get back in your place, boyo," he ordered in the voice of the Irish cop. A white cloud puffed into the werewolf's face. It roared suddenly stopped. It stared at Richie with almost comic surprise and made a choke, wheezing sound. Its eyes, red and blurry, rolled toward Richie and seemed to mark him once and forever. Then it began to sneeze. It sneezed again and again. Roppy strings of silver and few from its muzzle. Greenish black coats of snot flew out of his nostril. One of these splattered against Richie's skin and burned there. Like acid, he wiped it away with a scream of hurt and disgust. There was still anger in its face, but there was also pain. It was unmistakable. Bill might have heard it with his dad's pistol, but Richie had heard it more. First, with the voice of the Irish cop, and then with the sneezing power. Jesus, if I had some itching powder too, and maybe a joy buzzer, I might be able to kill it. Richie fought, and then Bill grabbed the collar of his jacket and jerked him backward. It was well, but did the werewolf stopping sneezing as suddenly as it had started and laughed as Richie. It was quick, too, incredibly quick. Richie might have only sat there with the empty envelope of Dr. Wacky sneezing powder in one hand, staring at the werewolf with a kind of drugged wonder, thinking how brown its fur was, how red the blood was, how nothing was in black and white in real life. He might have sat there until its paws closed around his neck and its long nails pulled his throat out, but Bill grabbed him again and pulled him to his feet. Richie stumbled after him. They ran around to the front of the house, and Richie fought. "It won't dare chase us anymore. We're on the street now. It won't dare chase us. Won't dare, won't dare." But it was coming. He could hear it just behind them, gibbering and snarling, slobbering. There was Silver still leaning against the tree. Bill jumped onto the seat and threw his fodder pistol into the carrier basket where they had carried so many played guns. Richie chanced a glance behind him as he flung himself onto the package carrier and saw the werewolves crossing the lawn toward them. Less than 20 feet away now, blood and slobber mixed on its high school jacket. White bone gleamed through its pelt about the right temple. There were white smudges of sneezing powder on the side of its nose, and Richie saw two other things which seemed to complete the horror. There was no zipper on the thing's jacket. Instead, there were big fluffy oranges buttons like pom-poms. The other thing was worse. It was the other thing that made him feel as if he might faint or just give up and let it kill him. A name was snitched on the jacket in gold thread, the kind of thing you could get down at Matcham for $1 if you wanted it. Snitch on the bloody left breast on the werewolf's jacket, stained but readable, were the words Richie Tozier. It lunged at them. "Go, Bill!" Richie screamed. Silver began to move, but slowly, much too slowly. It took Bill so long to get going. The werewolf crossed the reddening path, just as Bill pebbled into the middle of the Neobolt Street. Blood splattered its faded jeans, and looking back over his shoulder, filled with a kind of dreadful, unbreakable fascination that was akin to hypnosis. Richie saw that the seams of the jeans were given way in places. A tuft of coarse brown fur sprung through. Silver wavered wildly back and forth. Bill was standing up, gripping the bike's handlebars from underneath, head turned up toward the cloudy skies, cords standing out of his neck, and still the playing cards were only firing single shots. One paw grabbed for Richie. He screamed miserably and ducked away from it. The werewolf snarled and grinned. It was close enough so Richie could see the yellowing corners of its eyes, could smell sweet rotten meat on its breath. Its teeth were crooked fangs. Richie screamed again as it swung a paw at him. He was sure it was going to take his head off, but the paw passed in front of him, missing by no more than an inch. The force of the swing blew Richie's sweaty hair back from his forehead. Hi-yo, Silver, away! Bill screamed at the top of his voice. He had reached the top of a short, shallow hill, not much, but enough to get Silver rolling. The playing cards picked up speed and began to burr along. Bill pumped the pebbles madly. Silver stopped, wavering, or cut a straight course down. Neobolt toward Route 2. Thank God, thank God, thank God, Richie fought incredibly. Thank the werewolf roared again. Oh my God, it sounds like it's right behind me. And Richie's wind was cut off as his shirt and jacket was jerked back against his windpipe. He made a gargling, choking sound and managed to grip Bill's middle just before he was pulled off the back of his bike. Bill tidled backward, but held on the Silver's handlebar grips. For one moment, Richie thought the big bike would simply do a wheel-in and spill both of them off the back. Then his jacket, which had been just about ready for the rag bag anyway, parted down the bag with a loud whipping noise that sounded weirdly like a big fart. Richie could breathe again. He looked around and started directly into those muddy murderous eyes. Bill, he tried to hollow it out, but the word had no force, no sound. Bill screamed to hear him anyway. He pebbled even harder than he had ever had in his life. All his guts seemed to be rising, coming in on approaches. He could taste thick copper and blood in the black back of his throat. His eyeballs were starting from their sockets. His mouth hung open, scooping air, and a crazy, inimitable sense of an extermination filled him. Something that was wild and free and all of his own. A desire. He stood on the pebbles, coked them, battering at them. Silver continued to pick up speed. He was beginning to feel the road, now beginning to fly. Bill could feel him go. Hi-yo, Silver! He screamed again. Hi-yo, Silver! Away! Richie could hear the fast rattle thud of loafers on the matting. He turned the werewolf's paw struck him above the eyes with sudden force, and for a moment Richie really did think the top of his head had come off. Things suddenly seemed dim, unimportant, sounds fading in and out. The color washed out of the world. He turned back, Kingling desperately to Bill. Warm blood ran into his right eye, stinging. The paw swung away, striking the back fender. This time, Richie felt the bike waver crazily for a moment on the verge of tipping over. Finally, straightening it out, Bill yelled, Hi-yo, Silver! Away! Again. But that was distance too, like an echo heard just before it dies. Richie closed his eyes and held on to Bill and waited for the end. 14. Bill had also heard the running steps and understood that the clown hadn't given it up yet, but he didn't dare to turn around and look. He would know if it caught up and knocked them flat. That was really all he needed to know. Come on, boy, he fought. Give me everything now. Everything you got. Go, Silver, go! So once again, Bill Deathrod found himself racing to beat the devil, only now the devil was a hideous, grinning clown, whose face sweated white grease paint, whose mouth curved up in a leering red vampire smile, whose eyes were bright silver coins, a clown who, with some lunatic reason, wearing a Derry high school jacket over its silver suit, with the orange ruff and the orange pom-pom buttons. Go, boy, go, Silver! What do you say? Neilbert blurred by him now. Silver was starting to hum good now. Had those running football fading back a bit? He still didn't dare to turn around to see. Richie had him in a death grip. He was pitching off his wind, and Bill wanted to tell Richie to loosen up a little. But he didn't dare waste breath on that either. There up ahead, like a beautiful dream, was the stop sign marked at the intersection of Neobolt and Route 2. Cars were passing back and forth on Witcham in this state of exhausting terror. This seemed somehow like a miracle to Bill. Now, because he would have to put on his brakes in a moment or do something really inventive, he risked a look back over his shoulder. But he saw caused him to reverse Silver's pebbles with a single snap jerk. Slover skidded, laying rubber with its locked rear tire, and Richie's head smacked painfully into the hollow of Bill's tight shoulder. The street was completely empty, but 25 yards or so behind them, by the first of the abandoned houses, which formed a kind of funeral cottage leaping up to the train's yard, there was a bright fleck of orange. It lay close to a storm drain cut into the curb, and almost too late, Bill realized that Richie was sliding off of the back of Silver. Richie's eyes were turned up so Bill could only see the lower terms of the iris below his upper lids. The menacing bow of his glasses hung accused. Blood was flowing down slowly from his forehead. Bill grabbed his arm. They both slipped to the right, and Silver overbalanced. They crushed to the street. In a triangle of arms and legs, Bill barked his crazy bone, a good one, and shouted with pain. Richie's eyes flickered at the sound. "I am going to show you how to get these treasures," said Horn. "But freeze, man's, Dobbs ease, plenty dangerous," Richie said in a snoring gasp. It was Pinocchio and villain voice, but its floating unconnected. Its quality scared Bill badly. He saw several of Corse's brown hairs kingle into the shadow head wound on Richie's forehead. They were slightly kinky, like his father's public hair. They made him feel even more afraid, and he fetched Richie a strong smack upside the head. "Youch!" Richie cried. His eyes fluttered, then opened wide. "What are you hitting me for, Big Bill? You'll break my glasses. They ain't in a very good shape anyway." "Just in case you didn't notice. I thought you were dying or something," Bill said. Richie sat up slowly in the street and put on his hand to his head. He groaned. "What had that?" And then he remembered. His eyes widened in sudden shock and terror, and he scrambled around on his knees, gasping harshly. "Don't," Bill said. "It's gone, Richie. It's gone." Richie saw the empty street where nothing moved and suddenly burst into tears. Bill looked at him for a moment and then put his arms around Richie and hugged him. Richie clutched at Bill's neck and hugged him again. He wanted to say something clever, something about how Bill should have tried the bullseyes on the werewolf, but nothing would come out, nothing except sobs. "Don't, Richie," Bill said. Then he burst into tears himself, and then only hugged each other on their knees in the streets, besides Bill's spilled bike, and their tears made clean streaks down their cheeks, which were suited with coal dust.